Chapter 36 of The Mistress of Court Regna by Charles Garvice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 36. Sister Agnes had awakened the desire to live in Clare's heart, and her recovery was rapid enough to please even the doctor and the sister herself. As she regained her strength, she was eager to get back to her work at the school, and one day, when the sun was shining with the warmth which called up memories of the departed summer, she coaxed a reluctant permission from the doctor and went into the school. Her appearance was greeted with that murmur which takes the place of a cheer with girls, and Miss Gover was so delighted at seeing her that she was tempted, only tempted, to give the girls a half-holiday. But no one was more moved than little Tiny, who, disregarding all discipline, ran into Clare's arms and hugged her with childish cries of love and joy. For quite half an hour the school was disorganized, but presently Miss Gover's sharp tap with the ruler was heard above the babble of voices, and the goddess of work resumed her normal sway. Clare felt rather tired the first day, but before the week had passed she had regained her old strength, and entered into her daily labor with a zest which delighted Miss Gover, and brought its own reward to Clare. She and Sister Agnes now shared the same sitting-room, and when possible took their meals together. The sister never alluded to the story of her life nor to Clare's troubles, but in 1,000 little ways she showed her love for the solitary girl whom Providence had placed under her care, and Clare returned that love with interest. At the end of the street in which the school stood was a house much larger than those in the street, but like many of the others it was let in apartments. One day when Clare was returning to the school after dinner, she saw a fly standing at the door of Arundel House. An extremely fair and pretty girl wrapped in furs was lying back in the carriage. She looked very delicate and very listless, and the old gentleman who was with her regarded her as he helped her to alight, with that anxious and watchful expression which a father wears when he is tending his sick child. As Clare passed, her eyes and the girl's met for a moment, and so to speak lingered with a mutual admiration. The father and daughter stood aside to let Clare pass, and she went on her way. Several times during afternoon school she thought of the pretty girl, and it was only natural that, as she went by the house on her way home, she should look up at the windows. The girl was standing there, and evidently saw and remembered Clare, for she turned and said something quickly to someone in the room, and the old gentleman appeared at the window. The next morning, returning to dinner, Clare saw the girl going out. They looked at each other again, this time more attentively, and Clare fancied that there was a wistful expression in the blue eyes. Either at the window or in the street she saw her every day, and at last she asked Mrs. Holland who they were. The landlady of course knew something about them. There is a kind of freemasonry amongst landladies which induces an exchange of information about their respective lodgers. "Their name is Harling," said Mrs. Holland. "Father and daughter, miss. She do seem very delicate, don't she? Sweetly pretty, too. Her father seems very fond of her, and Mrs. Simpkins, their landlady, says as she thinks that they're very well off." That afternoon Clare missed her pocket handkerchief. As she was passing Arundel House, someone tapped at the window, and looking up, she saw Miss Harling holding up a handkerchief. She disappeared from the window, and Clare waited. A moment or two afterward the door opened, and Miss Harling appeared. She was a little flushed, as if with excitement, as she said, with wistful eagerness, "This is your handkerchief. I saw you drop it." "Oh, thank you," said Clare, smiling, and she held out her hand, but Grace whipped the handkerchief behind her back. "Do you want it very much?" she asked. Clare stared at her, then laughed softly. "Because if you do, perhaps you won't mind coming upstairs for it," said Grace. "Do you mind?" "I shall be very pleased," said Clare, and she followed the singular girl up to the drawing-room floor. "Won't you sit down?" said Grace. "You ought to give me in charge, for I as good as stole this handkerchief. I saw you drop it, and I didn't call after you, and father says that is as bad as stealing, Miss Sartoris." "I don't think I will give you in charge," said Clare. "You know my name?" Grace nodded, and leaned forward in her chair with a faint smile and the same eager, wistful air. "Oh, yes, I know all about you." Clare started slightly. "You lodge at Mrs. Holland's up the street, and you teach at the school. I have seen you go by every day, and I have often wanted to speak to you. Do you think that rude and forward of me?" I'm afraid it's what you call bad form in England." "On the contrary, I think it was very kind of you," said Claire. "If it was wrong, I must plead guilty to the same feeling, Miss Harling." "You know my name?" said Grace archly. Claire colored and laughed. "Curiosity is the failing of our sex," she said. "No, it's one of our virtues," said Grace in her shrewd little way. "I'm glad we know each other's names, because it does away with the necessity of an introduction. I'll tell you all the rest about myself if you like. I'm staying here with my father. He has a great deal of business to do with lawyers in London, and I can't live in London, because of the fogs, so we've taken rooms here." "And do you like it?" asked Claire. "Streatham, I mean." "Oh, yes," said Grace listlessly. "It's a pretty little place enough. The shops are rather nice. Oh, yes, I like it." She sighed and leaned back. "And now, won't you tell me something about yourself?" Claire winced for a second, then she said quietly, "There is very little I can tell you. You know where I live. I teach at the school, and that is all." "Forgive me," said Grace. "I am rude and inquisitive. But I didn't ask from idle curiosity, but by way of saying that I wanted to know you. I have seen you so often as you passed by, that I felt as if we were old friends. And it is very strange. The first time I ever saw you, I thought I must have met you before. There is something in your face that awakened some recollections. But, of course, I know that I've not met you, I mean to speak to, until now." At this moment Mr. Harling entered the room, and looked from one girl to the other with natural surprise. Grace rose and took his arm coaxingly. "Father, this is Miss Sartoris. I have netted her at last. It was with a handkerchief. I played a mean trick upon her, but I think she will forgive me, for I've been telling her how much I wanted to know her. Speak up for me, father, and tell her that I am a very lonely, solitary girl, a stranger in the land, and that I am just dying for one girl-friend." Mr. Harling patted her hand and looked at Claire pleadingly. "I'm afraid this is all very irregular, Miss Sartoris," he said, "and that you will think us very peculiar folks. But my girl here is not over-strong, and she's been spoiled." "Thank you, father," said Grace. "I couldn't have done it better myself. After that I am sure you can't refuse to stay to tea," she added to Claire. Claire was sorry to refuse, but she was obliged to do so. "I cannot stay this afternoon," she said, "because my friend, the lady with whom I live, would be anxious about me. I always reach home at a certain time, and she would not know what had become of me." "You mean the Sister of Mercy?" said Grace. "Yes, Sister Agnes." "What a pretty name," said Grace. "We have often seen her, and wondered what she was like, for her face is always hidden by her veil. But she looks as nice and sweet as her name." "Yes," said Claire simply, but with deep significance. "She is everything that is good and gentle. But for her, I should not be alive now to sing her praises." "Father, couldn't you go round presently to Sister Agnes, and explain that we have kept Miss Sartoris prisoner?" said Grace. But Claire, knowing how carefully Sister Agnes avoided meeting strangers of her own class, rose and said that she would run home and come back presently. She found the sister awaiting her. "I am glad you have found new friends, dear," she said. "Go by all means." She seemed a little agitated as she asked, "What did you say the name was?" "Harling," replied Claire. "They are very nice people, and the girl seems overflowing with kindness. I am afraid she is very delicate. It is touching to see the affection between her and her father. His anxiety is so obvious. I won't stay long, sister." "Stay as long as you like, dear," said Sister Agnes very quietly. Claire was just a wee bit excited by the novelty of the circumstances, and did not notice the peculiar constraint of Sister Agnes's manner. She went back to Arundel House and had tea with the father and daughter. Grace treated her almost like an old friend, and Mr. Harling was extremely kind, but he was very thoughtful, and once or twice Claire found him looking at her with a singular intentness. He asked her one or two questions as to how long she'd been living in London, and so on, and presently left the girls alone. "Now we will have a nice chat," said Grace, and she proceeded to give Claire a sketch of her life. but she did not tell her that her father was a principal shareholder in the Butterfly Mine. As she listened to Grace, Claire felt half ashamed of her own reticence. She could tell her nothing of herself in return. "I hope we shall be great friends," said Grace. "I'm inclined to think there is a special providence about our meeting, and I'm also inclined to believe that friendships as well as marriages are made in heaven. You'll come for a drive with me sometimes, won't you? I can't walk very far. I've often watched you admiringly as you came down the street. You look so strong, and you walk so gracefully." Claire laughed. "Don't be offended," said Grace. "I couldn't help telling you how much I admired you if I tried. I'd often heard of the beauty of the English girls, but I've never seen one half so pretty as you. But pretty isn't the word. Now, I suppose I am what people would call pretty, in the sixpenny doll style, but you are— oh, I can't find the exact word." "Don't try," said Claire, laughing but blushing a little. "I've got it. Distinguished. That's the word. You wear things like the great ladies one sees driving in the park. Now that dress fills me with admiration and despair. I've never succeeded in getting one to look anything like it. Where did you have it made? Anywhere but here." "It is one of Redfern's," said Claire, making the admission absently. Grace stared and laughed. "You extravagant girl," she said. "Fancy wearing a red fern to teach in a school. I'm afraid it's thrown away upon the girls, or perhaps you use it as an object lesson, a lesson on form." Claire colored slightly. "I have had it a long while," she said. "It is one of my old dresses." Grace looked at her shrewdly. "You were not always a schoolmistress in Streatham," she said. Claire looked at the fire. How could she venture to tell this warm-hearted girl? "Not always," she said. "I knew it," broke in Grace. "The first time I saw you I said to father, 'That girl is a lady.' I mean what the English people call a lady, meaning a swell. It's a horrid word, dear, but it's the only one that expresses the meaning. You carried your head and walked like the pictures of the marchionesses and countesses one sees in the illustrated papers. And so you were rich once, and didn't always teach in a school. Did you lose your money? You don't mind my asking you?" "Yes, I lost my money," said Claire, "or rather, it never was mine. I can't tell you the whole story, and indeed it does not matter. I am quite happy." She checked a sigh even as she spoke. "And I do not think that money matters very much. I don't want you to think that I am posing as a high-minded kind of person. What I mean is, that one can be, if not very happy, at least content, teaching in a school in Streatham." Grace looked at her admiringly and touched her hand with girlish sympathy. "I should like father to hear you say that," she said. "It is just what he admires. All the world has gone mad about money lately, and I am delighted to find someone who thinks lightly of it, and who cares as little for the loss of it as you do." "I lost something else besides money," said Claire with an impulse that was new to her. "But I'm getting over it. One has an idea that all the misery in the world has fallen to one's lot. But I have learned otherwise. Sister Agnes has taught me that, however much one has suffered, there are others who have suffered more deeply." Her face seemed transfigured as she spoke, and Grace looked at her with a kind of awe. "Now you look noble," she said under her breath. "Please don't stick me on an imaginary pedestal," said Claire with a laugh. "You would find that I should tumble off so very, very quickly." "Too late," said Grace. "I have stuck you up there already, and I know you'll never come down." So they sat over the fire and talked until the striking of 10 by the clock on the mantelpiece startled Claire to her feet. And this was the strange beginning of an acquaintance which ripened with extraordinary rapidity into a warm friendship. Grace seemed to have given her heart wholly and unreservedly to Claire, and confided to her everything, except her knowledge of a gentleman named Gerald Ware. She coaxed Claire into taking a drive with her nearly every day, and the drive did them both good and brought back the glow of health to Claire's face. Grace even paid a visit to the school, but as she put it was very quickly "chucked," for her appearance created too much excitement in that region of decorum and strict discipline. Claire, of course, talked a great deal about her friends to Sister Agnes. But though she was glad that Claire had made the acquaintance of the Harlings, the sister could not be persuaded to meet them. "They lie outside my world, dear," she said. "I dread strange faces, excepting those of the poor and wretched. There is no room in my heart for anyone but them and you, and my dead child." One day Mr. Harling came into the room where the two girls were sitting talking over a new dress for Grace, and announced that he would be obliged to take a journey into the country. Grace looked aghast. "I couldn't possibly go further," she said with an air of mock sternness. "For one thing, I've got to see about this dress, and for another, I couldn't possibly leave Claire. Now, if Claire would come with us—" Claire laughingly shook her head. "Very well," said Mr. Harling. "I will leave you behind, to the care of the landlady, and if I may venture to say so, to Miss Sartoris." Grace put on the airs of a little child. "Do. I'll promise to be good and do everything she tells me. Oh, Claire, couldn't you come here and live all together while father is away? Now that's a splendid idea. In fact, I won't consent to his leaving me unless you promise to come. Indeed, it wouldn't be safe. I'm not to be trusted. I should get a latchkey and go to one of your music halls every night, and behave generally like one of the new women." Claire said she would come if Sister Agnes approved. "You treat her as if she were your mother," said Grace, with a little pout. "She has been more than a mother to me," said Claire. Sister Agnes gave her permission, and Mr. Harling started on his journey. "I will wire my address," were almost his last words. The following day Gerald was walking into Thraxton to see the inspector of police there, for he had at last decided to place Lucy's case in the hands of a good detective, for he himself had failed to find the slightest clue, although he had made inquiries in every direction, and had devoted all his time and energy to the search. As he strode along, in deep thought, he saw a fly approaching, and glanced at it absently. Then he started and stopped dead short, for the occupant was no other than Mr. Harling. Gerald shouted and stopped the carriage, and Mr. Harling and he stared at each other in mutual astonishment. "Why, lad," said Mr. Harling, with a certain warmth of affection in his tone more marked even than of old. "You here?" "Yes," said Gerald. "Haven't you had my letter? I wrote to Lartree." "I've not been back there," said Mr. Harling. "I've been traveling about, on business. You here, of all places in the world," he added in a lower tone. "How strange that you should come to this place," said Gerald on his side. "Oh, I told you I was a kind of wandering Jew," said Mr. Harling in rather a confused manner. "And this is one of your show places, isn't it?" Gerald nodded. "How is Miss Grace?" he asked. "You haven't brought her with you. I hope she is not unwell." There was a friendly anxiety in his tone, but nothing warmer. "Grace is all right," said Mr. Harling. "I left her in London." "And so you've come to see Court Regna?" said Gerald. Mr. Harling started and looked at him curiously. "That's the great show place," explained Gerald. "Oh, yes, I've come to see Court Regna," said Mr. Harling. "Jump in, my boy." Gerald hesitated a moment, then reflecting that he could go back to Thraxton with the fly, got in. "It's very extraordinary your being here," said Mr. Harling. "Well, it isn't really," said Gerald. "I was employed some months ago to renew a wing at the court." Mr. Harling stared at him. "I'm afraid you will think I've been very close and secretive, Mr. Harling," said Gerald, his tanned face flushing. "But I had reasons for not mentioning the matter. It is a sore subject with me." Mr. Harling watched him closely. "The work was suddenly discontinued, and I left the place under a cloud. Yes, under a cloud in many senses of the word, for I was suspected of having enticed one of the village girls to accompany me. I hope I need not say that I am quite innocent of the villainy." "No, my boy," said Mr. Harling. "Thank you," said Gerald, glancing away. "But things looked very black against me, and still look. I only heard of the poor girl's disappearance when I returned here the other day, and I have decided to remain here until I have found her and proved my innocence." "Good, very good," said Mr. Harling. "That's just what I should expect you to do, my lad." "I came back by the merest chance," said Gerald, "to see Miss Sartoris," his tone softened at the name, "to give her some papers belonging to her that I had by accident." "Miss Sartoris, the owner of the court?" said Mr. Harling. Gerald nodded. Mr. Harling was silent for a moment or two, and then he said, "Lord Wharton left it to her, didn't he?" "He did," said Gerald. "Rather strange, that," remarked Mr. Harling. "No," said Gerald, up in arms for Claire at once. "He adopted her when she was a little girl. He had no near relatives. It was only right that he should make her his heiress." Mr. Harling looked at him fixedly. "No near relatives?" he said. "No," said Gerald. "Has Miss Sartoris a sister?" asked Mr. Harling after a pause. Gerald replied in the negative. "Why do you ask?" Mr. Harling mumbled something in response and turned to look at the view. They were nearing the court by this time, and the exquisite beauty of its surroundings seemed to impress the old gentleman very much. Presently a portion of the great house came in sight. "It is a magnificent place, magnificent," he exclaimed under his breath. "Surely it must be one of the finest places in England." "It is," assented Gerald. "And it all belongs to this Miss Sartoris?" "Everything," said Gerald. "The house, all the land as far as you can see and further, the village down there in the hollow. Isn't it quaint? Even the fishing smacks in the bay there." "She must be a kind of queen," remarked Mr. Harling. "She is," said Gerald, with a deeper note in his voice. They went past the lodge gates and down toward the village. At the head of the steep street they got out, and Gerald conducted Mr. Harling down the steps. He looked about him with the deepest interest. "Where are you staying?" he asked. Gerald pointed to the cottage. Mr. Harling looked at him with the same curiously intent gaze. "That is where the poor girl and her father lived," said Gerald. "I shall stay at the inn for a night or two," said Mr. Harling. Gerald promptly went in and ordered a meal and a comfortable room. They returned to the Fly to drive round the celebrated avenue, which wound in serpentine fashion round the court grounds, Mr. Harling exclaiming at the beauty of the scene at every point. As they came to one of the lodges, he said, "Could I see the court?" "Oh, yes," said Gerald. "Miss Sartoris is always very glad for visitors to go round the place. In a sense it almost belongs to the public." "Oh, does it?" said Mr. Harling quaintly, and he muttered to himself as they came suddenly upon the front of the house, stretching in a long line against the sky. They drove up to the door, and Mr. Harling got out. The hall porter came to meet him. "Is Miss Sartoris within?" asked Mr. Harling. He turned to Gerald quickly. "I should like to thank the young lady for permitting me to see this beautiful place." "Miss Sartoris is not at home, sir," said the hall porter. "Miss Sartoris is away," said Gerald at the same moment. "I would have told you that if I had known." "I beg pardon," said Mr. Harling. "I saw that the house looked occupied." "Mr. Sapley is living here," explained Gerald quickly. The hall porter stood looking from one to the other. "Would the gentleman like to come in, sir?" he suggested. Mr. Harling said he should like very much, and they entered the hall. The old gentleman looked round him with a sort of admiring awe. He had often read of such a place, but had never seen one. The magnificent hall, suffused with the winter light filtered through the richly stained windows, impressed him to a remarkable extent. The butler came forward, and bowing to Gerald, threw open the drawing-room door, and invited them to enter. In a similar way Mr. Harling was shown all the principal rooms, "state rooms," as the servants were fond of calling them, and he gazed about him in silent admiration. The butler was gratified by the effect produced. "Perhaps the gentleman would like to see the pictures, sir," he said. And he led them up the broad stairs to the corridor, and with gracious dignity pointed out the more famous of the masterpieces. "Family portraits, sir," he said, and he rolled off some of the historic names. Mr. Harling walked along in the usual fashion, nodding now and again, and evidently greatly interested. As they came to the last, Lord Wharton's portrait, He stopped, and looked at it with an intense and indescribable expression on his weather-beaten face. "The Right Honourable Algernon Edward Vincent Gerald Wharton, Earl of Wharton," reeled off the butler with solemn pride. Mr. Harling seemed scarcely able to withdraw his eyes from the picture. At last he said in a constrained voice, "Is that the last of the portraits?" "It is, sir," said the butler. "Lord Wharton was the last earl. He was never married, and the title is now extinct." "Indeed," said Mr. Harling. He looked round him as if searching for something, and the butler politely paused on the way down. "Is there a portrait of Miss Sartoris here?" asked Mr. Harling. "I regret to say that there is not, sir," said the butler. "Miss Sartoris is a very beautiful young lady, if I may make so bold to say so, as Mr. Ware knows, and her portrait would be a great ornament amongst the others." Gerald coloured and averted his face, and said nothing. As they descended the stairs, old Sapley came out of the library and shuffled across the hall. He glanced up at them, then disappeared by the outer door at the back of the hall. "Who is that?" asked Mr. Harling in an undertone. "Mr. Sapley, the agent," replied Gerald in as low a voice. Mr. Harling rubbed his chin and said nothing. They reached the door, and he turned to thank the butler when Mordaunt Sapley came up the step. His head was bent, and he did not see them for a moment, and he looked up with a start, and Gerald almost started also, for the man's face, seen for the instant without its mask, was white and haggard, as if he had just heard bad news. It was the day after Jenks' visit. "My friend, Mr. Harling, has been looking at the rooms and the pictures," explained Gerald. "This is Mr. Mordaunt Sapley," he added to Mr. Harling. Mordaunt had slipped the mask on by that time, and he smiled amiably. "My father will be very pleased," he said. "Pray take your friend over the grounds, or wherever you like to go." "Thanks," said Gerald. Mordaunt Sapley bowed and passed into the hall. "Very polite gentleman," said Mr. Harling when he and Gerald had got out of hearing. "He and his father, I suppose the old man we saw in the hall was his father, seemed to be very much at home. He spoke as if the place belonged to them." "Yes," said Gerald with a frown. "I don't understand." He didn't finish the sentence. Mr. Harling dismissed the fly, Gerald deciding to walk into Thraxton, and they went toward the west wing. "That's the wing I was at work on," said Gerald rather grimly. "Let us come away if you've seen enough of it. I have some unpleasant associations connected with it." "Let us go back to the inn," said Mr. Harling. He was singularly silent on their way, and seemed extremely thoughtful. When they sat down to the meal which had been prepared for them, he said suddenly, "When is Miss Sartoris coming back?" "I don't know," said Gerald. "No one seems to know. I was going to say that there was a kind of mystery about her absence, but the expression would be scarcely justified, excepting by the fact that no one knows her address, not even the Sapleys." Mr. Harling poured himself out a glass of ale. "It's rather singular," he said. "By the way, isn't it rather odd, too, that there's no portrait of her up at the court? I'm rather disappointed. It's only natural that one should want to see what the mistress of such a grand place is like." "Are you so very curious?" said Gerald, rather hesitatingly, and putting his hand into his breast pocket. "Yes, I am," responded Mr. Harling decisively. "There you are, then," said Gerald, and he pushed the pencil sketch of Claire across the table. "It's a sketch I took of her, without her knowing it, some months ago. It's an awful libel on her, heaven knows, and yet it's like her enough to give you an idea. Good Lord, look out!" he broke off, snatching up the sketch. For Mr. Harling had, with unusual awkwardness, let his glass of ale slip out of his hand. "I beg your pardon," he said. "Tut, tut! How clumsy of me! I hope it hasn't gone on the picture," he added as he mopped up the spilled beer. "Let me look at it again, will you?" "There you are," said Gerald. "It's all right. I set a value on it far beyond the worth of the miserable sketch. Well, what do you think of it?" Mr. Harling, aided by his knowledge of the circumstances, had recognized the schoolmistress of Streatham. He was lost in amazement and bewilderment, and absently exclaimed, "It's the image of her." "What?" said Gerald. "You've never seen her?" Mr. Harling colored and got up to ring for more ale. "I mean that I dare say it's the image of her, only you're too modest to say so, my boy," he said, laughing curiously. End of chapter 36. Chapters 37 and 38 of The Mistress of Court Regna by Charles Garvice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 37. Gerald took back the sketch and gazed at it, with a lover's look in his eyes, for a moment or two in silence. Then he said, as if he had suddenly made up his mind, "Look here, sir, I feel as if I've got to tell you. You have been so kind to me, and I feel, somehow, as if you were the best friend I have in the world. And indeed I've no one else to tell, and the thing is like a burden upon me. This lady, Miss Sartoris, the Mistress of Court Regna, well, I've been mad enough to fall in love with her." Mr. Harling had half suspected this, and he sighed, for he thought of Grace and her hopeless love, and, father-like, suffered a pang on her account. But he was a generous-hearted man, and he liked Gerald. Indeed, had grown very fond of him for more reasons than the all-sufficient one that he had saved Grace's life. "Go on, my boy," he said encouragingly. "I'm half ashamed, too," said Gerald, "for it must sound so preposterous to you. You have seen Court Regna. You know how rich she is, how lofty the position she occupies there, and you know what I am." "Yes, I know what you are," said Mr. Harling quietly. Gerald lighted his pipe. "A penniless adventurer," he went. "A mere nobody. It was madness, of course, but I can no more help it than I can help breathing. You have no idea what she is like." "Haven't I? No, I suppose not. This ridiculous sketch doesn't give the least idea of her. She is one of the loveliest of God's creatures, and as good as she is beautiful. I met her by chance, and was thrown into daily communication with her while I was renewing that west wing. Why, no man could help loving her if he had seen her as often as I did. There is a nameless charm about her, which only those could understand who came under its spell. She is very proud, but not in a vulgar way. She is humble enough in some things, and, like yourself and Miss Grace, thinks very little of wealth. And I suppose because of that, and because she was gracious enough to be friendly and kind to me, I up and told her of my love, as the song says." "And what did she say?" asked Mr. Harling, deeply interested. "She said, 'No,'" said Gerald, stifling a sigh and smoking hard. "The night before I had ventured to call her by her name, and I had gone away from her hoping. Well, the next morning all my hopes were slain. She said no, and I left her." "She didn't care for you?" said Mr. Harling. "I suppose not," assented Gerald with a grim smile. "You don't speak with certainty." Gerald colored. "Don't think me a coxcomb," he said. "Frankly, I have always had a vague kind of hope that she didn't dislike me." "Then why?" asked Mr. Harling. Gerald shook his head. "I can't tell you. I thought for a moment or two the other day it was because of this scandal about this poor girl Lucy Hawker, but I remembered that Miss Sartoris could have heard nothing of that when she refused me." "Why didn't you ask her again, lad?" said Mr. Harling. "I've not seen her," said Gerald. "I left the place at once." He told the story of the broken leg. "When I came back she was gone, as you know, and if I had asked her again, I feel that she would have given me the same answer. I know there's no hope for me. She's the only woman I shall ever love. There's not a day that I don't think of her. In fact, I carry her about with me in my heart, just as I carry her sketch in my pocket." Mr. Harling seemed about to speak, and then checked himself, and after a pause said, "Nobody knows where she is." Gerald shook his head. "As you say, that seems to me rather extraordinary. And it's very extraordinary that the Sapleys should be living in that big house of hers. My boy,
I don't like the look of those two men. I'm not given to fancies, but I've taken a red-hot dislike to both of 'em. The old man with that hawk-like face of his looks capable of anything, and the son, though he's not a bad-looking chap, had a hang-dog countenance when we first saw him today. You don't suspect any foul play, Gerald?"
Gerald frowned and smoked furiously.
"What foul play could there be?" he said. "You don't suppose they've put Miss Sartoris out of the way?"
And he laughed at the grotesqueness of the idea.
"No, I don't," replied Mr. Harling, "though upon my soul both father and son look capable of it."
Gerald laughed again.
"Scarcely that," he said. "But I wish I knew where she is."
Mr. Harling again seemed about to blurt out something, and again checked himself. "She may come back soon," said Gerald. "I may be here, for I shall not go away excepting for a day or two for the purposes of my search, until this mystery of Lucy's disappearance is solved. I shall see her once more and give her some papers I have of hers, and then I shall go back to Lartree and finish Miss Grace's portrait, and set off on the tramp again." Mr. Harling looked at him curiously. "You will make your fortune yet, my boy," he said. "Your sort always does in the end. Keep up your heart." He leaned across the table and patted Gerald on the shoulder. "Things may come all right after all. Who knows?" Gerald shook his head. "A fortune wouldn't be much use to me without her," he said. The talk had upset him, and he paced up and down the room restlessly. "I have to go to Thraxton about this business of Lucy Hawker's. You won't mind me leaving you? You'll find plenty to interest and amuse you if you stroll about this place." "Off with you, lad," said Mr. Harling. "I shall find plenty to amuse me." After Gerald had gone, the old man sat staring at the fire and rubbing his chin. Then, with an air of resolution, he suddenly jumped up, put on his hat and coat, and walked out toward the court. He stopped now and again on his way, and looked hard at the ground, as if he were thinking deeply and was not quite clear as to his course of action. When he reached the court, he asked for Mr. Sapley. "The old gentleman, please." A footman took him into the library. Old Sapley was sitting at the table, with his head sunk between his shoulders, very like a hawk indeed. Mordaunt's illness and his extraordinary behavior on the preceding night had affected the old man very much indeed, and he was still brooding over it when his visitor was announced. He gazed up at Mr. Harling morosely, and repeated the name several times, as if trying to remember it, then he shook his head. "I don't know you," he said. "It's my son Mordaunt you want to see, I expect." "No, it's you, Mr. Sapley," said Mr. Harling, taking the chair which old Sapley motioned him to. "I am a stranger to you, and I will state my business at once. I am a friend of Miss Sartoris's." Old Sapley started slightly, and a sharp look came into his cunning eyes. "I'm glad to see any friend of Miss Sartoris's," he said, "though I never heard your name." "Harling. Harling," he repeated. "But my memory's bad lately. What can I do for you?" "As a friend of Miss Sartoris's," began Mr. Harling. Old Sapley, watching him intently, broke in, his eyes growing shifty as he rubbed his hands one over the other. "If you've come here on her behalf, Mr. Harling, I'm afraid you've come too late." "Too late?" echoed Mr. Harling. "Yes," said old Sapley, showing his fangs in a senile sign of triumph. "When we offered Miss Sartoris terms, she would have been wise to have taken them. Circumstances have altered since then. I don't say that my son Mr. Mordaunt Sapley," he corrected himself promptly, "wouldn't marry her even now. But there's no need for it. You may have heard of my son, Mr. Harling. He's one of the principal men in the place. He's standing for the county. You may have read his address. My son is a clever man. He's trying to be a great one. He could do better than marry Claire Sartoris." To say that Mr. Harling was filled with surprise would be but to inadequately describe his amazement. Mr. Sapley saw it, but ascribing it to a different cause, chuckled with malicious enjoyment. "She should have taken him when she could have got him," he said. "I made her the offer myself, though I was dead against it.
But Morty had a fancy for the girl, and I didn't want to balk him. I never refused him anything. I've been a good father to Morty. A good father. A good father." He maundered off, almost childishly. Mr. Harling sat speechless, and Mr. Sapley pulled himself together again and went on. "So, as I say, it's too late. My son can look higher. I shouldn't be surprised if he married a title. There's a good many daughters of poor peers about. Lots of 'em would jump at my son with his money and his position." Mr. Harling wiped his forehead. Was the old man mad? "I don't understand, Mr. Sapley," he said. "Oh, I see," said old Sapley. "You've come about money. The allowance he offered her." "You offered Miss Sartoris money," said Mr. Harling. Yes, certainly the old man must be mad. Mr. Sapley nodded, then looked up sideways with a grin. "She's come down a peg or two, has she?" he said. "I thought she would. Nothing like poverty for bringing down high stomachs. We've humbled her pride, have we? Lord knows we suffered enough from it, Morty and I. Well, you've come on a poor errand, Mr. Harling. The offer was made without prejudice, as we lawyers say, and it's withdrawn. She treated it with scorn, and she's humbled herself too late. You tell her from me that she won't get any allowance out of us. She'll have to work for her living, as many a better woman has done." He chuckled and looked at Mr. Harling cunningly. "Perhaps she thinks that there'll be something left after the mortgage and the bonds are satisfied. If so, tell her not to count on that, for there won't be a penny left when our claims are satisfied." "Your claims," began Mr. Harling, but old Sapley interrupted him. "She has told you all about it, I suppose. You're a lawyer, eh?" Mr. Harling did not contradict him. Indeed, old Sapley in his triumph did not wait. "Well, I'm not afraid. Everything's straightforward. You won't find a flaw, a screw loose. We've given her formal notice of foreclosure, and shall sell off when the notice terminates." He laughed and rubbed his hands. "Of course we shall take over the place ourselves." "I see," said Mr. Harling, and indeed he did see the whole of the cunningly planned business. "I will tell Miss Sartoris what you say." "Ah, do," said old Sapley insolently. Mr. Harling rose. "Will you tell me the total of Miss Sartoris's indebtedness to you, Mr. Sapley?" Old Sapley took out a pocket-book and consulted it and gave the amount. "Pretty large, eh?" he said with a grin. It is very large," assented Mr. Harling. "I am much obliged to you, Mr. Sapley, for the information you have given me." "You're welcome," said Mr. Sapley. "And I will only trouble you further to give me the date of the foreclosure." Old Sapley gave it to him. "Very close, ain't it?" he said. "Very," assented Mr. Harling. "I will wish you good day now, Mr. Sapley." Old Sapley nodded curtly. "Good day. I'm afraid you haven't done much good, eh?" And he leered up at him. "I should recommend you to throw up the case. You'll make nothing out of it. I give you that advice as a brother professional. Needy clients bring no wool, eh? Throw it up." "Thank you for your advice, Mr. Sapley," said Mr. Harling. "I will consider it. Good day." He was still struggling with his amazement when he got outside, and though he stood and looked at the house, it is scarcely too much to say that he did not see it. "The old scoundrel," he murmured to himself as he walked along. "The infernal scoundrel. That poor girl. To think that she's teaching school while that old carrion crow is perching in that pretty nest of hers. It's desecration, that's what it is. And he'd got it all so cut and dried and beautifully arranged. Why, it's like a romance. Yes, you must come over to the old country if you want romance. The bald-headed old vulture." But presently his anger and indignation gave place to anticipatory satisfaction, and he smiled to himself as he trotted along the road toward the inn. 38.
Gerald came back from Thraxton late in the evening. He looked somewhat disappointed and discouraged. "Well, lad," said Mr. Harling, "come and sit down and have a glass of toddy. What news?" Gerald drew his chair up to the fire and pushed the hair from his forehead. "Oh, not satisfactory," he said. "The inspector can't help me. He said it's not a matter for the police at all. No offense against the law has been committed, and therefore the police cannot take the affair up. He pointed out that if they were to undertake to find every girl who ran off with her lover they would have their hands pretty full. If she'd taken any of her father's goods they would have been justified in trying to find her. Or if there was any reason to suspect foul play, it would of course be their business to follow the matter up." "And you don't suspect foul play?" said Mr. Harling. "Oh, no," said Gerald. "Why should I? The inspector suggested that I should employ a private detective and get a good man down from London." "Well, why not?" said Mr. Harling. Gerald colored and looked hard at the fire. "Well, for one thing," he said, "I haven't the means, and for another I have a repugnance to bringing a strange detective into Regna and making the poor girl's story public." "As regards the money," said Mr. Harling, "I should take it as a favor if you'll let me find that. When I say a favor, I mean it. I'm very much interested in anything that concerns you, my boy, and this concerns you very deeply. Besides, I like to do a little good with my money if I can. It's a luxury. You run up to London and see a first-rate detective. You needn't bring him down, but just lay the case before him. He may be able to give you a hint." "Very well, I will, sir," said Gerald, "and thank you. And while I am in London I should like to go and see Miss Grace, if you'll give me her address." Mr. Harling hadn't thought of this, and he rubbed his chin and looked rather confused. But there was no help for it. "She'll be very glad to see you, my lad," he said. "Arundel House, Streatham, just outside London." They sat and talked until a late hour, but Mr. Harling said nothing of his second visit to the court, and then Gerald went off to the cottage. He saw Jenks just outside. "I'm going up to London tomorrow, Jenks," he said. He was just about to add, "to see a detective," but pulled himself up in time. "Are you indeed, sir?" said Jenks. "Ain't heard o' nothing fresh, sir, I s'pose?" Gerald shook his head, and Jenks with a "good night" sauntered on. Mr. Harling went to see Gerald off by the train the next morning, and at the last moment put a letter into Gerald's hand. "I wish you'd run into my bankers, London and Westminster, with that, Gerald," he said. "You'll get there before they close." Gerald promised. Mr. Harling wrung his hand affectionately, and the train started. Gerald took a cab straight to the bank and handed in the note. It was received with the respect which is generally accorded to communications from a millionaire, and the manager came out to say, "Certainly, certainly. We will do what Mr. Harling asks, to any amount. I will write him to that effect." As Streatham was so near London, Gerald thought that he would go down there after he had seen the detective, and put up at a hotel in the place so that he might call upon Miss Grace the next morning. He went down to the office of a well-known detective, and had an interview with the famous man, who listened to him without interrupting, and remarked quietly, at the finish of Gerald's statement, "I'm afraid there's been foul play, Mr. Ware." Gerald was startled. "Good heavens, why?" he said. "I will tell you," said the detective. "When a girl runs away, she invariably communicates with her people. Sooner or later she writes a few lines, or else she comes back to them. If the man marries her, she goes back as proud as Punch. If he deserts her, she writes, as I say. Now, this girl was not one of the hard and vicious sort." "No, no," said Gerald. "Just so. And she wouldn't leave her father without a word. I speak from experience. I've had hundreds of similar cases through my hands, and I've always found that they've worked out as I say." But, said Gerald, "what is it you suspect?" "That the girl has been made away with," said the detective in a matter-of-fact tone. Gerald went pale. "I can scarcely imagine that," he said. "What am I to do? Where am I to look?"
"Well, of course I should say, 'Send me down there,'" replied the detective with a smile. "But I can easily understand your reluctance to do so. If you want a hint, I say, look for your man at Court Regna." Gerald shook his head. "I have looked for him there. I know every man in the place. There is no man there capable of such a deed." The detective smiled and glanced at his watch. "All the same, I think you'll find I'm right, Mr. Ware," he said. "You go back there and keep your eyes open. If you want me, send me a wire, and I'll come down by the next train and find a clue." "There doesn't seem to be any clue," said Gerald despairingly. "I beg your pardon, there is always a clue," said the detective cheerfully. "And it's just in spotting them that we detectives have the pull over you amateurs. Good afternoon, and thank you." Gerald took the train for Streatham. He would see Miss Grace and go back to Regna at once. The least he could do would be to follow the detective's advice. As he was inquiring his way to the hotel, outside the station he saw a small crowd collected at the corner of a street. He had to pass it on his way to the hotel, and he stopped to see what was the matter. In the center of the crowd a small boy was lying in the road. A Sister of Mercy was kneeling beside him, quite regardless of the mud, with his head upon her arm, and a brewer's dray standing beside the pavement, its driver staring helplessly and despondently at the boy, made the accident plain to Gerald. He pushed his way through the gaping crowd and addressed the Sister of Mercy. "Is he very much hurt?" he asked. "Can I help you?" She raised her head and looked at him, and Gerald was struck by the sweetness of the pale, deeply lined face, so greatly impressed that for a second he forgot the object of his inquiries. The sister, too, seemed startled, either by his sudden presence or the question, and her sad placid eyes rested on his face with a half-frightened, half-inquiring gaze. But she recovered herself in an instant or two, and said in a low voice, "He has been run over and has fainted. I am waiting until he has sufficiently recovered to remove him. There is a village hospital in the next street, and I will have him taken there." Gerald bent down on the other side of the boy, and gently moved his arms and legs. "I don't think there are any bones broken," he said. "I think we might move him now," said the sister after a little time. "If you will get a cab." Gerald picked the boy up in his arms very tenderly and carefully. "I think he'll travel better this way," he said. "I shan't jolt him so much." The sister walked a little in front of him to show him the way. The crowd, of course, followed them open-mouthed. Gerald carried the child into the neat little room of the village hospital, and the doctor came in. "I will wait outside and hear what is amiss with him," said Gerald. Presently the sister came out to him. "He is not very much hurt," she said. "He was half stunned by striking his head when he was knocked down, and very frightened. Would you like to see him?" Gerald said he should, and he followed her in. The boy, very large-eyed and pale, looked inclined to whimper, but Gerald addressed him in just the proper tone, and so arrested the tears. "Well, my little man," he said, "I am glad to see you are not very much hurt after all." He sat down beside him and took his hand. "I suppose his people are coming," he said to the sister in an undertone. "He's an orphan," said Sister Agnes, "but I will take charge of him." "Then he will do very well," said Gerald. Sister Agnes, from the other side of the bed, raised her eyes and looked at Gerald's handsome, sun-tanned face with a nervousness that was quite foreign to her. And Gerald, as he met her gaze, felt the same strange sensation of which he had been conscious when he first saw her face. There was a troubled and preoccupied expression in her eyes, and her hand trembled as it smoothed the counterpane. "You have been very kind," she said. "I have not thanked you yet." Gerald smiled. "I've done very little," he said. "He will need all his thanks for you, mother." He had addressed her by the maternal title often accorded to the sisters of the poor, but it seemed to have a strange effect upon her. She grew deathly pale, her lips quivered, and Gerald fancied that the sad, patient eyes had grown suddenly moist. "I am called sister," she said. "I beg your pardon," he said reverently, "but I expect you are mother as well as sister to many of these poor folk. May I know your name?" "I am called Sister Agnes," she said in a low voice. "Sister Agnes,"
he repeated as reverently as before. "May I come in to see the little fellow again?" he asked. "I am staying here for a day or two. I am a stranger here, and putting up at the hotel." She seemed to listen, as if she were listening to something more than his words, and it was evident that she was battling with an agitation quite unusual with her. "Yes," she said in a low voice. "He will be glad to see you. I shall keep him here until he is quite recovered." Gerald rose, but was conscious of a strange reluctance to go. Something about this sad-faced, white-haired sister of Mercy cast a kind of spell over him. He knew that he had never seen her before, and yet it seemed to him as if he had not only seen her but known her very well. He attributed this peculiar feeling to the influence, subtle and not to be described, exercised by her sacred calling, and the patient sadness and gentleness of her voice and manner. For the sake of saying something, in excuse for lingering, he said, "Can you tell me the way to Arundel House?" She raised her eyes to his, with a half-startled questioning, and her lips moved for a moment or two without speech. She told him. "Are you going there?" she asked. "You have friends there?" "Yes," said Gerald. "I am going to see a young lady named Harling." She repeated the name, then sunk into the chair beside the couch, with her head bent and her hands clasped together. Gerald was alarmed, and thought that she was ill. He went round to her and bent over her. "Are you ill?" he asked. "This has upset you. Can I get you a glass of water?" She rose, but looked so fragile, so tremulous and likely to fall, that Gerald ventured to put his hand upon her arm supportingly. She trembled still more, and looked into his face with a half-fearful, half-yearning expression in her eyes. "It's all right," said Gerald in his cheery way, and yet with a tenderness and gentleness which brought the tears to her eyes. "There's no need to be troubled about him. The little fellow is all right. Sit down and rest. I'll send the nurse to you." She had, perhaps unconsciously, put her hand upon his. She drew it away now, and turned her head aside so that the veil hid her face. "No, no," she said. "I am all right. Do not send for her. I would rather be alone." Gerald's hand lingered on her arm for a moment or two. He also was agitated. "I will come again," he said, and slowly left the room. When he had gone, Sister Agnes covered her white face with her hand. "What is it?" she moaned to herself. "The voice, the face seemed to go to my heart. Why did I not ask him his name? And he is going to see some people of the name of Harling. Oh, I am in deep waters, deep waters." Her lips moved in silent prayer for a moment or two, but when the nurse re-entered, Sister Agnes was as calm and placid, though paler than usual perhaps, as was her wont. Gerald went to the hotel and got some dinner. All through the meal his meeting with Sister Agnes haunted and troubled him, and when he went to sleep he dreamed that she was standing beside the bed, and was bending over him with a look on her face which one sees in the pictured faces of the saints. After breakfast the next morning he made his way to Arundel House. The street was full of children, for it was Saturday and a holiday, and Gerald, who was fond of children, looked at them as he threaded his way through the groups with a pleasant smile. He was told that Miss Harling was in. "At least I think she is, sir," said the servant. "If you'll come upstairs." She opened the drawing-room door, and Gerald entered. A lady was sitting with her back to the light. She was reading, and did not look up for the moment, and Gerald went toward her with "Miss Grace" on his lips, then he stopped dead short, as if he had been shot. The lady looked up, uttered an exclamation, and so they stared at each other for the space of a second in breathless silence. Gerald was the first to speak. "Claire! Miss Sartoris!" he exclaimed, as if he could not believe that she was really there, within a few paces of him, and indeed he could not. The book dropped from Claire's lap as she rose. All the color had fled from her face, and her lips were tightly compressed, as if her heart were throbbing painfully. "Mr. Ware," she said. The sight of her agitation increased his. "You here, Miss Sartoris?" he said. "How is this?" Claire was making a tremendous effort to regain her self-possession. The sight of him set every nerve in her body thrilling, as the strings of a harp thrill to the touch of a familiar hand. "Why should I not be here, Mr. Ware?" she said, trying to speak coldly. Her manner aroused Gerald's spirit. After all, he had endured a great deal at her hands, and even a worm will turn if you tread on it too hard. "Miss Sartoris," he said, "you speak to me, you look at me, even at this moment of surprise when we meet, to our mutual astonishment, as if I had committed some capital crime, or offended you beyond hope of pardon." Claire bit her lip. "You did not come to see me?" she asked. "No," he said almost sternly. "I came to see Miss Harling." "She is a friend of mine. I am staying with her. I will go and fetch her." "One moment, if you please, Miss Sartoris," said Gerald, rather gravely. "I am aware that I have no right to ask the question, but well, I flattered myself that you once honored me with your friendship, and I will therefore venture to ask you why you have left the court, concealed your address, and caused your friends, I am thinking of others besides myself, great anxiety." Claire looked down, but made no reply. "Very well," he said. "I take your silence as an intimation that it is no business of mine. But, Miss Sartoris, I have now to ask you a question which I deem I have a right to put." Claire began to tremble. And yet how sweet to her was the voice, stern and almost angry as it was. "The last time I saw you I had the audacity to tell you that I loved you." The color rose to Claire's face, and her eyes began to glow under her lids. "It was an audacity, I admit, and very likely you only treated me as I deserved to be treated." Claire's lips parted as if she were about to speak, but she remained silent. "You dismissed me very promptly, very haughtily. As I said, I have no right to complain of that, but I do complain of your after treatment of me, and I am so loath to believe that it was inspired by a pride quite unworthy of you that I feel that it is only just to you to give you an opportunity of telling me why you have treated me so cruelly. What have I done, beyond daring to love you, that merits such treatment?" He had poured all this out in a kind of stand and deliver way, but it was evident that he was deeply agitated by her presence, by the sight of the lovely face which was never out of his dreams. Claire went very pale. "I do not deny that right, Mr. Ware," she said, "and if you insist upon an answer, I will tell you why our friendship should cease." "Tell me, please," said Gerald curtly. "In one word, then," said Claire almost inaudibly, "what has become of Lucy Hawker?" Though he had half expected this, Gerald was staggered. You believed it, then?" he said. He was silent for a moment, fighting with his indignation, then he said with a forced calm, "You believed that I was guilty? Well," he laughed bitterly, "after all, it's not so wonderful. The evidence was very strong. I left the place the same day, and yet surely there must have been some doubt in your mind. Couldn't you, in common charity, have given me the benefit of that doubt?" The appeal went straight to Claire's heart, but she tried to steel herself. "I saw you with her in the park, the night you left me," she said slowly, painfully. Gerald stared at her. "Well, I do not care. The girl came up to me, mistaking me for someone else. She was in trouble. I comforted her, as I would comfort and console any helpless woman, child, dog, what you will." Then his eyes flashed and his face grew crimson. "Good heavens! Did you think me capable of uttering words of love to you one moment, and intriguing with a village girl the very next? Why, no one in this wide world could be such a monster of treachery and deceit." Claire had believed it, but now she believed it no longer. There was truth in his voice, in his flashing eyes. A hot wave of shame, remorse, self-loathing swept over her. Oh, if she had but seen him before! Why had she not sent for him? Why had she not? But what was the use of asking foolish questions now? There he stood, a strong man filled with just wrath and indignation, and she was a cowering, remorseful woman, aching with love and the desire of forgiveness. She longed to throw herself into his arms, to sink at his feet, to plead for one look, one word of the old love she had cast away for pride's sake. But she felt powerless to move, and no word would pass her lips. And Gerald, half blinded by his anger and misery, did not understand what was passing through her heart. "Very well," he said. "You have answered me, Miss Sartoris. It only remains for me to tell you that you still have some justification for your suspicions, but—" At this moment the door opened, and Grace ran in. "Whatever is the matter?" she began. And then, at sight of Gerald, she stopped and looked from one to the other with an intense questioning. Then she said, "You know him? You are friends?" "No, Miss Grace," broke out Gerald. "We were friends, but Miss Sartoris has withdrawn her friendship. My meeting with her here is quite unexpected. I came to see you. I will come again. Miss Sartoris," he turned to Claire, "I will only add one word to what I have already said. I left Regna on that day in one of the coasting vessels, the Susan. She is on a voyage now, but she may return any day. The hour she sails into Regna harbor my innocence of the dastardly crime of which you have deemed me guilty will be clearly proved. Good day." He strode from the room, leaving the two girls standing there like two leaves round which a storm has been sweeping. There was silence for a minute or two. Then Grace crept up to Claire, and putting her hands on Claire's shoulders, looked up into her face. "Claire," she whispered, "it is you he loves." There was a pause as her eyes dwelt on Claire searchingly, then she added, "And you love him?" "Yes," said Claire woefully. I love him, and I have lost him." End of chapters 37 and 38. Chapters 39 and 40 of The Mistress of Court Regna by Charles Garvice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 39. Gerald went away from Arundel House fuming. At sight of Claire his love for her rose flame-like, and devoured him. That she should have thought him guilty of such hideous treachery and deceit, that she should have doubted the sincerity of his love for her, and deemed him capable of bestowing a thought upon another woman, drove him mad. "I've seen her for the last time," he said to himself, and then he groaned. For, oh, how he loved her! How beautiful, how queenly, and yet how sweet she was! He loved her better, more passionately than ever. Well, he'd go away. Directly he had solved Lucy's disappearance he would leave England, and never come back to it. He was so agitated and bewildered that he did not ask himself why Claire was living in London, and why she had concealed her address. And he walked about the pretty streets and commons of Streatham like a man half demented. After a while he remembered the injured lad, and his promise to go and see him. He went round to the village hospital, and found the boy very much better. While he was sitting beside him and talking to him in that way that children love, Sister Agnes came in. She looked very pale, and even sadder than she had done the day before, and she stopped short when she saw him, as if his presence startled her. Gerald felt again the peculiar sensation, the indefinable interest, which had been aroused when first he saw her. "You have come," she said. "He is very much better. He has been talking of you, and been wishing to thank you." She bent over the child and kissed him, then sunk into the chair on the opposite side of the bed to Gerald. They talked for some few minutes, as much to the boy as to each other, and presently the lad fell asleep, lulled perhaps by the sister's softly placid voice. Suddenly yet gently Sister Agnes said, "You are looking ill this morning. Are you ill?" Gerald was rather startled by the question, gently as it was put. "No," he said. Then an impulse, a man's craving for a woman's sympathy, took possession of him. "No, I'm not ill, but I am in trouble." "I am sorry," she murmured in a low voice. I wish that I could help you. Do not deem me presumptuous. The weakest and most insignificant of us can help sometimes, the strongest and most self-reliant." "Well," he said with a miserable little laugh, "I've just quarreled with the woman I love. I'm afraid that you will think that a trifling kind of trouble,
but it's a very big one to me, and is almost unendurable. What is it the poet says? To be wroth with those we love doth work like madness in the brain. I don't know whether I've got it quite correctly, but it just expresses what I feel." "Perhaps you will make it up and be friends again," she said softly, and with a deep interest in her voice and eyes. Gerald shook his head and sighed. "I'm afraid not," he said. "I'm afraid I've seen her for the last time. I shall leave England very soon, and I don't know why I tell you this, Sister Agnes, but somehow I feel as if we were not strangers, as if we had known each other for a long time." She bent her head. "I am glad to hear you say that," she said almost inaudibly. "I wish I could help you." He sighed. "Thank you, but no one can help me, I'm afraid. It's just a piece of bad luck." "There is no such thing as luck, chance," she murmured. "There is a divinity doth shape our ends, rough hew them how we will. We are all in the hands of a ruling providence, who guides our weak and blundering steps to the appointed end." "Mine have been weak and blundering enough," he said. "I'm a kind of waif and stray. One of those straws that get blown about the world by every puff of wind." "You speak as if you were alone in the world," she said after a pause. "I am," said Gerald rather sadly. "I haven't a relation that I know of." "Your father, mother?" she asked, with head still bent, and face hidden from him by her veil. "Both dead. I never knew them. I should have been a better man, and a happier, if my mother had been left to me. I've never heard a chum speak of his mother without feeling a pang of envy. But I'm boring you, sister. This little chap sleeps soundly, doesn't he?" As he spoke, he smoothed the sheet under the pointed little chin. In doing so he let his hand linger on the bed. It happened to be the left, and the ring he wore, the ring Claire had found for him in the room of the west wing, shone conspicuously against the whiteness of the counterpane. The sister's eyes rested on it absently enough for a moment. Then suddenly she bent forward, gazing at the ring as if spellbound. That is a handsome ring you wear," she said. Will you let me look at it?" "Certainly," said Gerald, and he took it off and held it out to her. She took it after a moment and examined it. He could not see her face, or its pallor would have alarmed him. Where did you get it? Forgive me, but—" She broke off, as if she could not frame the question. "The ring? I've had it ever since I was a boy," he said easily. "To whom did it belong?" she asked in a subdued voice. "To my father or mother, I don't know which. The people who took charge of me gave it to me, and, strange to say, I have kept it through all my wanderings and vicissitudes. I have been hard up times out of number, but I never could bring myself to part with it. It was a kind of link with the past, the only link, for the rest of the chain has disappeared." She laid the ring on the bed, her face still averted. "You speak as if there were some mystery about your birth," she said with calm, almost monotonous voice. "There is," he said. "I'm afraid it is a very commonplace one," he added, as he slipped the ring on his finger and turned it over thoughtfully. "Will you tell me your name? I do not know it yet. The boy asked me. I could not tell him." "Gerald Ware," he said. She neither moved nor spoke, and yet Gerald felt as if his answer had in some way affected her, perhaps because of her silence. "Well, I must be going," he said. "I am glad the little fellow is all right, and I am glad to have met you, sister. Perhaps," his voice grew softer and full of a certain reverence, "perhaps we shall meet again." "Yes," she said in a strangely unemotional voice. "Will you tell me where you are going?" "I am going back into the country, to a place called Regna." She rose, then sunk down again, and her hands clasped each other spasmodically. "I shall go to-morrow night, I think. But I am not going to remain there. I shall leave England presently. I've nothing to stay for now. Goodbye, Sister Agnes." She did not rise, but stretched out her thin hand, and he took it, and held it. He could not see her face, but he fancied that her hand trembled, and he felt vaguely troubled and moved,
and he raised her hand to his lips and kissed it reverently. Her lips parted with a deep sigh. She raised her eyes for a moment and looked at him, then with a faint "Good-bye," bent her head and so hid her face under the veil. "The ring, his ring," she murmured hoarsely as he left the room. "The name, my name, and Regna. O God, deal mercifully with me. If the hope that has arisen within my heart is more than a baseless dream, give me strength to bear my great joy," she prayed. Gerald felt all the better for his interview with Sister Agnes, and in a calmer state of mind went round to Arundel House the next morning. He asked for Miss Harling, but in his innermost heart he hoped to see Claire, of course, and he was considerably staggered when the maid said, "Miss Harling's out of town, sir." "Out of town?" echoed Gerald almost incredulously. Was it possible that she declined to see him? He asked himself bitterly. "Yes, sir. She'd a letter from her father directly after you were here yesterday, and went off early this mornin'. Is there any message?" Gerald shook his head, and went back to the hotel in a state of mind more easily imagined than described. Then he went up to London to catch the night mail for Downshire. The letter that had arrived for Grace had surprised her, accustomed as she was to her father's erratic movements. In effect it said, "Come down by the 11 o'clock train from Waterloo to Yoford, and bring Miss Sartoris with you. I have a special and important reason for wishing her to accompany you. I will meet you at Yoford." Claire was at Arundel House when this rather peremptory epistle arrived, and she had at first said that it was impossible she should go. But Grace had declared that she could not and would not go without her, and had herself gone round to Miss Gover and begged for a holiday for Claire. It was not difficult to get, for Miss Gover knew that the change would do Claire good, and was able to fill her place with a pupil teacher. Sister Agnes, too, helped to persuade Claire. "You will not be gone long, my child," she said, "and you will come back strengthened for your work." So at last Claire yielded, and the two girls started. Grace was not in the best of spirits, and Claire was very quiet and thoughtful. She was running away from London, perhaps from her only chance of seeing Gerald again. She and Grace had said very little about him beyond those few words which Grace had uttered after Gerald had left the room, but she had told Claire of the way in which Gerald had saved her life, and Claire had listened with downcast eyes and rather tremulous lips. She was thinking of him when the train reached Yoford, and almost started when Grace said, "Claire, I wonder why my father has sent for us, where we are going, and why he so specially wanted you." "From sheer kindness," said Claire. Grace shook her head. "Of course, I know that he would be glad to have you come with us. But don't you remember what he said in his note about a special and important reason?" Claire smiled. "His special and important reason lies in his desire to give me a pleasant change, Grace," she said. "What other reason could he have?" "I don't know," said Grace thoughtfully. "But I soon shall," she added. Claire looked out of the window dreamily. How long ago it seemed since she had fled from the court, homeless and well-nigh penniless. How often she had travelled on the same line, the heiress of Court Regna. And now she was just Miss Sartoris, a teacher on probation at a national school. At Yoford, Grace, who was looking out eagerly, exclaimed, "Here is father." Mr. Harling opened the carriage door. "There are 2 portmanteaus, father," she began, as she got her things together in preparation for alighting. But Mr. Harling smiled and pushed her gently back into her seat. "We don't get out here, Grace. How do you do, Miss Sartoris? It was very good of you to come. I have had the portmanteaus relabeled." "Not get out here? Why, where are we going, then?" demanded Grace, opening her blue eyes to their widest. Mr. Harling smiled and looked at Claire curiously. "Are you very anxious to know, Miss Sartoris?" "Of course she is," broke in Grace. "Why, ever since we got your letter we have spent the time asking each other why you sent for us and where we are going. Tell us, father." "We are going to Thraxton, if Miss Sartoris has no objection." Claire colored painfully. "To Thraxton?" she echoed. Then she looked at him questioningly. But the old gentleman shook his head slightly, as if withholding the explanation. "And why Thraxton, father?" said Grace.
"Why not that as well as any other place, my dear?" he retorted quietly. And Grace, shrugging her shoulders, subsided, remarking,
"Few girls have such a trying father as mine, Claire, especially when he has any mysterious business on hand. I suppose we shall have to wait until he wishes to explain."
"There is a nice old ruined castle at Thraxton," he said, mildly, but with a twitch of the corners of his mouth. Claire said nothing, but she felt rather mean and secretive, and her embarrassment increased as they neared Thraxton. Ought she to tell these good friends that she had been the owner of the well-known Court Regna that lay just beyond the place they were going to? Once or twice she almost made up her mind to lean forward and tell Mr. Harling, but her resolution could not be brought to the sticking point. When they reached the station, Mr. Harling helped them out, and offered his arm to Claire. "I have a carriage waiting," he said quietly, and he led them to a pair-horse barouche, the best hotel could turn out.
"Where are you going, father?" demanded Grace rather pettishly. "We seem to be driving right through the town."
"We are," said Mr. Harling. "Lean back and let me cover you up with the rug. We are going to a place called Regna." Claire could not repress a startled exclamation.
"To Regna?" she said. "Mr. Harling, oh, why did I come?"
And her face flushed and grew pale by turns. "Because you were kind enough to trust one who desires, with all his heart, to be a friend, my dear," he said impressively. "I knew that if I wrote that we were going to Regna that you would not come."
"No," said Claire. Oh, if you knew."
"Perhaps I do know," he said soothingly. "Perhaps I know more about it than even you do, my dear."
That I once lived at the court?"
said Claire, amazed. "Yes," he said, "and why you left it." They had been speaking in tones too low to reach Grace, but Claire's exclamation as she heard his words attracted Grace's attention, and he touched Claire's hand warningly. "Will you trust me a little longer, Miss Sartoris?" he said. "I will promise that, though you may see cause for surprise and even doubt, that I will do nothing indiscreet or prejudicial to your interests. I have a reason for asking you to accompany me to the court."
"The court? Oh, I cannot go there. Indeed, I cannot go there."
"It is too late," said Mr. Harling, with kindly decision. "We are passing in at the gates now. Be calm, my dear. You have, I hope I may say, a friend with you who will protect and, please God, right you."
Claire sunk back very pale now, and trying hard to be calm and self-possessed. The whole business was at present a mystery to her. Her mind was confused by her unexpected presence at the court of which she was no longer mistress, and Mr. Harling's evident acquaintance with her loss. And what memories! Not only her lost wealth and station, but of Gerald, the familiar drive awakened. She trembled so much as the carriage drew up and Mr. Harling helped her out, that he stopped for a moment and patted her hand encouragingly. "Where are we, father?" exclaimed Grace, staring at the house, and then at them.
"At Court Regna, Miss Sartoris's house, my dear," he replied.
"No, no," exclaimed Claire breathlessly. "Let me explain. Oh, I cannot go in." For Mr. Harling had led her into the hall, and the butler was coming forward with surprise and pleasure fighting for mastery in his face. "Oh, we didn't know you were coming home, miss," he said. "I'm afraid the rooms, but I'll send for the housekeeper." "I am not going to stay," began Claire, almost too confused to speak, and not a little moved by the man's evident joy at her return. But Mr. Harling pressed her arm.
"I think you will stay," he said in a low tone.
Meanwhile Grace had looked about her with mingled astonishment and admiration. In the course of the talk which had naturally followed on Grace's discovery that Gerald was Claire's lover, Grace had learned something of Claire's story, but she had not imagined that the house which Claire had lost was so large and imposing. "And this was yours, dear?" she exclaimed under her breath. "Oh, how could you bear to lose it? And why has father brought us here? I wish he would tell us. But that is the worst of him. He can be as secretive as a jackdaw when he likes. I am simply burning with curiosity and trembling with excitement." She whispered this as the butler led them to the small drawing-room and quickly lighted the candles. "I will have the fire lighted immediately, miss, and send a maid to you." "No, no," said Claire quickly and decisively. "I am not going to remain." As she spoke, they heard a step shuffle across the hall, and old Sapely entered. "Who is this?" he demanded in his harsh voice, and peering across the dimly lighted room. "Who is it?" Mr. Harling stepped forward. "It is Miss Sartoris, Mr. Sapely. Miss Sartoris and her friend, my daughter." Old Sapely stopped dead short and stared, and his sharp eyes turned from one to the other with a surprised gleam in them. "Mr. Mordaunt," he said to the butler. "Mr. Mordaunt. He is in the library." Then he turned to Claire. "Glad to see you, Miss Sartoris. You have come back to make some proposal, I suppose. Or just come to look at the old place, eh? Very pleased to see you. And your young lady friend. Take a chair." But Claire still stood, looking straight before her, her face pale, her brows knit. Why, she was asking herself, had these kind friends subjected her to this humiliation? The door opened, and Mordaunt entered. Even at that moment Claire was startled by the look of his face. It had the expression which was like the shadow of despair, as if he had a presentiment that his luck was changing. "Miss Sartoris," he exclaimed, with a forced smile of welcome, "this is a pleasant surprise. When did you arrive? Why did you not let us know? Your rooms are being prepared for you and your friends." He glanced from one to the other with a simulation of pleasant welcome. Claire raised her eyes. "I came unexpectedly, unwillingly, Mr. Mordaunt," she said. "I shall not stay." "Oh, but indeed," he murmured. But his father interrupted him with a harsh laugh. "What's all this mean?" he exclaimed sardonically. "There's some meaning in it. Some trick or other. Whatever it is, out with it. Miss Sartoris might have been welcome enough a little while ago, when we offered to make terms. But things have altered. Court Regna is hers no longer." "Pardon me," said Mr. Harling smoothly. "That is a strange mistake for you, a lawyer, to make, Mr. Sapely. Let me remind you that the notice of foreclosure has not expired yet, and that Miss Sartoris is in her own house, is sole mistress of Court Regna." "No, no," murmured Claire painfully. "Let us go. Please let us go. I surrendered it long ago to Mr. Sapely." "I beg of you to be silent, to leave this to me, my dear," said Mr. Harling quickly, but gently. Then he turned to the old man. "I am right, am I not?" Old Sapely glared at him. "Strictly speaking, yes," he said with a snarl, "but Miss Sartoris gave up." "Have you any deed of surrender?" "No. Miss Sartoris is a woman and was helpless and friendless. She is friendless no longer. I have, I admit without her knowledge, taken upon myself the honor of acting as her friend and adviser. And I say she has a perfect right to occupy her own house." "Certainly," exclaimed Mordaunt, "and my father and I are delighted that she elects to do so. We have been living here because we thought it better that the place should not be left to caretakers." "Silence," said old Sapely. "All this is flummery and nonsense. What is the use of her coming here and playing the mistress, when she knows that she will have to turn out in a few weeks?" "Why?" demanded Mr. Harling smoothly. "Why?" croaked old Sapely. "Why? You know well enough, Mr. Harling. She can't pay off the mortgage, and she is bound to go." "Pardon me," said Mr. Harling. "Miss Sartoris is prepared to pay off the mortgage." "What?" old Sapely gasped, and his eyes started. Then he laughed scornfully. "Tell that to the Marines," he said. "Pay off?" he laughed derisively. But Mordaunt had been watching Mr. Harling closely, and began to suspect the truth.
It would be better to tell it to your solicitor, unless you are acting for yourself, which is unusual, isn't it, Mr. Sapley? However, I beg to give you notice that Miss Sartoris is ready to meet your claims at any moment you are prepared to establish them. There is the formal notice." He placed a paper on the table near him. "And there is a letter from the London and Westminster Bank stating that they will honor her cheque to the amount demanded, or a much larger one," and he laid the letter beside the paper. 40. Old Sapley darted at them. But when he had got them in his claws, he looked at them as if he had lost the power of reading. His sallow face went livid, and his mouth opened and shut. Then he uttered a cry so full of the agony of disappointment and dismay that Claire could almost have found it possible to pity him. As he staggered and clutched at the table, Mordaunt went up to him and took the letters from his hand, read them carefully, and then addressing Mr. Harling, said, "I understand." His voice was scarcely audible, and his words came with a labored slowness. "I understand." He turned to Claire, who stood regarding Mr. Harling with blank astonishment. "Miss Sartoris, you have won. You have beaten us." He shrugged his shoulders, and a smile twisted his thin lips. "Well, it is the fortune of war. We were the victors when last we met. We are now the vanquished. Mr. Harling is right. You are still Mistress of Court Regna, and we—" his face reddened with humiliation and rage, "we are interlopers. We will leave the house at once. Come, father." He laid his hand on the old man's shoulder. Old Sapley raised his head slowly and looked up at him with a dazed, uncomprehending stare. Then an expression of cunning self-satisfaction stole over his livid face, and he chuckled. "Master of the court, eh, Morty?" he mumbled. "Mine at last, at last. This is a proud day for us, Morty. Mordaunt Sapley, Esquire, M.P., member for West Downshire. Mordaunt Sapley, Esquire, of Court Regna." They listened to and looked at him with a slowly growing apprehension and horror. Did he fail to realize it, or had the shock of the disappointment driven him mad? "What's she waiting for, Morty?" he demanded croakingly, and pointing a shaking finger at Claire. "Why don't you tell her to go? Let her go, Morty. She's a nobody and not fit for you. You'll marry a title now, Morty." Mordaunt took the old man's arm and almost raised him by force. "Come away," he said harshly. Claire moved forward a step or two. "No, no," she said pitifully. "Let him stay." But Mordaunt swung round on her like a wolf driven to bay. "What?" he said, showing his teeth and glaring at her. "Accept your hospitality. We have not sunk so low as that, Miss Sartoris. I would rather die than remain beneath this roof, now that it is yours. Reserve your pity for those that need it. We are no longer your servants. Your servants." He laughed defiantly. "We treat with you as equals. We leave the place at once. Come, father." And putting his father's arm within his own, he almost dragged him from the room. As they went into the hall, a further humiliation awaited them. Servants know everything that happens to their masters and mistresses almost as soon as they themselves. Perhaps someone had been listening outside the door. Old Sapley had spoken loud enough to be overheard. Anyway, the hall was full of servants, and they stood and stared superciliously at the father and son as they came out of the drawing-room. Mordaunt glared at them. "My father's coat and hat," he said fiercely. "Order a carriage. Damn you! Why do you stand and stare and gape?" "Oh, we'll be quick, Mr. Mordaunt," said the butler, stung into retaliation. "It's the first order of yours we've executed willingly. Mr. Sapley's togs, James, and look sharp." Mordaunt snatched them from the footman and put them on the shaking, shrunken figure. "Where are we going, Morty? I don't want to go," whimpered old Sapley. "Hold your tongue," snarled Mordaunt. The servants melted away from the hall, and presently, in an incredibly short time indeed, the carriage came up to the door, and Mordaunt almost carried his father into it.
As the porter closed the door he heard a sharp cry, a wail of disappointment and despair from the old man. The three left in the drawing-room looked at each other in silence for a moment or two. Then Claire went up to Mr. Harling. "Oh, I can't understand it, realize it all, yet," she said, her voice trembling with emotion. "Is it true? Have you paid all this money for me? But I cannot take it. You must know that I am very, very grateful. It seems wonderful, incredible, that anyone could be so generous. But oh, I could not take it. You must not ask me." Mr. Harling took both her hands and led her to a chair. "My dear," he said gently, as a father speaks to his daughter, "you shall tell me all this tomorrow, after you have rested and realized the change that has come over your fortunes. And let me assure you that you will pain me very much indeed, if you allow your pride to rob me of the greatest satisfaction my money has hitherto afforded me. You are too kind-hearted to do that, isn't she, Grace?" "Yes," exclaimed Grace, "and too sensible. My dear Claire, you don't know my father yet, or you'd know that when he has made up his mind to do a thing, not all the women in the world would prevent him. Besides, father, I must say it, he is so disgustingly rich that I suppose this money is a mere nothing." "Hush, hush, my dear," pleaded the old man as if he were ashamed. "It won't quite ruin us, my dear Miss Sartoris. And to tell you the plain truth, and to make a clean breast of it, I've done what I've done to further my own ends, and you'd better wait to learn what they are before you utter a word of gratitude." "Gratitude? It's I who ought to be grateful, as you'll discover presently. And now we won't say a word more about it, tonight at any rate. Just forget that you ever left the court, and try and persuade yourself that we are your guests for a day or two, as we will be, if you will have us. Oh dear, it sounds very rude, but I am tremendously hungry." Almost as he spoke, the butler appeared. "Dinner will be served in an hour, miss," he said, as gravely and in as a matter-of-fact tone as if Claire had never been absent. "Your rooms are ready, sir." It was a strange meal, that dinner. They were almost too excited to eat. And yet the servants, by their manner, were evidently trying to carry out Mr. Harling's idea, and persuade Claire that she had never for an hour ceased to be the mistress of the court. That there were rejoicings in the servants' hall at the sudden change of affairs was demonstrated by the buzz of excitement which now and again rose from that locality, and at intervals the staid butler permitted his unbounded satisfaction with Claire's return to display itself in his countenance. The three sat and talked late into the night, but Mr. Harling would not permit his coup de théâtre, his beautiful little plot for the destruction of the Sapleys, to be discussed. He would talk of anything but that, and Gerald. It is scarcely necessary to say that he was carefully avoided. At last Mr. Harling insisted upon their going to bed. But even when they went upstairs the two girls found themselves in one room and still eager to talk. "Oh, Claire, I don't know whether I am on my head or my heels," said Grace, sinking at Claire's feet on the thick fleecy rug before the fire, and leaning her arms upon Claire's knees. "And yet it seems so perfectly right and fitting that you should be queening it here. You look the mistress of this place, vast and grand as it is. And tomorrow you are going to show me how much vaster and grander it is than even I imagine it, aren't you? Well, it makes me happy to think of it. And you, Claire, dear, I should like to know exactly how you feel." Claire laid her hand on the golden head. "I am too bewildered to feel anything but gratitude." "You are not to speak of that," broke in Grace quickly. "Are you happy, quite?" "No." She looked up at Claire searchingly. "Not quite." "Ah, I know, dear." And she sighed. "You are thinking of him." The color rose to her face, and she looked aside. "Claire, what will you do?" "What can I do?" murmured Claire. "Ah, what can I do?" "You have been very wicked," said Grace. "You have wronged the noblest, truest, best of men." Her breath came fast, too fast for her words. Claire looked down at her. Grace," she whispered. Grace flushed to her white neck. "Yes, dear," she said, answering the question put in that one word. "Yes, it is true. I loved him. Wait, listen. Do not misunderstand. I said loved. I loved him with all my heart. I would have given all the world if he could have loved me. But I knew he could not, even before I knew that his heart was given to you. And I have fought with my love for him until I have torn it out of my heart. And yet there is love for him there still. A sister's love, Claire. There is nothing I would not do for Gerald Ware. I could die for him as he was ready to die for me. I would go to the end of the earth just to win an hour's happiness with him. Oh, how am I to make you understand?" Claire bent down and kissed her. "You are more worthy of him than I am, Grace," she said almost with a moan. "You have never wronged him, misjudged him, while I ache and burn with shame when I think of the way I have treated him. No wonder that he paid me back with scorn and contempt." "Not that, dear," said Grace quietly. "Yes, yes, and 100 times yes," said Claire scornfully, "and it was only what I deserved. I could almost wish that he had struck me the other day. I could have borne a blow better than the look in his eyes, the words which keep ringing in my ears and torturing me. Would you do anything to win his forgiveness?" "Anything," echoed Claire passionately. "Is there anything I would not do? Think of the extent of the wrong I did him. And he was poor and I was rich then. And he must have thought that I treated him, that I was proud of my money. Oh, Grace, Grace, when I think of it all, I feel as if I should go mad." "You are rich still, he is poor still," whispered Grace. "Go to him, Claire." Claire started, and the blood rose to her face with maidenly shame. Then she grew pale again, and a light glowed in her eyes. "Yes, I could go to him. But I shall never see him again. I feel that. He looked it when he left me the other day." "You must go to him before it is too late," said Grace earnestly. "Before it is too late?" "Yes. Oh, my dear, don't you see? He is still considered guilty by some, will be considered guilty until he can prove his innocence. And he will be able to do that when the ship, the Polly, the Susan, or whatever is its ridiculous name, comes back. If you wait till then— ah, well—" Claire held her breath. "Oh, Grace, how I love you for thinking of that. Oh, where is he?" And she began to pace the room. Grace got a little frightened. "In bed where you and I ought to be," she said. "And you shall go now. I shall stay. Oh, yes, I will, for I know what you will do. You will walk up and down like a tiger all night, Claire. I won't leave you tonight. Let me stay with you." And she put her arms lovingly around her. "Why, your heart is beating like a sledge-hammer, and you are shaking. Oh, dear, no wonder he loves you when you love him like this." Gerald got down to Thraxton the next morning and walked to the cottage at Regna. Although the news of Miss Sartoris's return had passed round Regna like a flash of lightning, there was no one about to tell him, and as he was cooking his breakfast he was thinking of her sadly. After breakfast he would run over to the inn and ask for tidings of Mr. Harling, for it is scarcely necessary to say that Gerald had no suspicion that Grace and Claire were in the neighborhood. He had made his breakfast, and was toasting a piece of bread on the end of a fork, when he saw someone pass the window. It was a woman's figure, but he had not time to recognize it, and was turning the slice of bread when there came a knock at the door. He got up and opened it, with the toast in his hand, and almost dropped the latter in his amazement. For there stood Claire. Claire herself. "Can you tell me if Mr. Ware—" she had begun, but there she stopped, crimson and white by turns, and stood with downcast eyes, speechless. "Claire, Miss Sartoris," he said, gasped rather. You want to see me?" "Yes," she said, painfully catching her breath. They told me that you had stayed here. I wanted to know—" Then her courage crept back to her. "Yes, I wanted to see you." He held the door open wider and drew back. "Won't you come in?" he said. How commonplace, how grotesque the familiar phrase sounded. She walked in, and he put a chair for her, but she did not take it, and stood before him with downcast eyes, the loveliest picture he had ever gazed on. At last she raised her eyes and looked at him, and the look made his heart leap within his bosom, and the fork to shake in his hand. "Mr. Ware," she said, and her voice was scarcely above a whisper, and so humble, so meek, I have come to ask you to forgive me." Gerald stared at her and repeated the words slowly. To forgive you?" "Yes, ah, yes. I have wronged you cruelly. No one has ever been so wickedly mistrusted and cruelly wronged. I know it now. I know how vile and baseless was my suspicion." She could not go on for a moment, and Gerald stammered, "You have heard—" "I have heard nothing but what you told me," she said eagerly, passionately. "I knew when you spoke, at the first word you uttered, that you were innocent. And I let you go thinking that I still suspected you." "You believe I am innocent?" he stammered. "Without proof?" "Thank God for that. Miss Sartorius, this makes me very happy." Claire's heart sunk at the Miss Sartorius. And you forgive me?" she faltered. "Forgive you?" he said earnestly. "There is nothing to forgive. Rather, I ought to ask your pardon for behaving like a brute the other day. Yes, and I do ask your pardon, Miss Sartorius, most humbly." "Oh, no, no, no," she cried, and yet in a whisper, "It is I who behaved like a brute." "No, no," he said eagerly. "You were right to suspect me. After all, it was only natural." "Natural?" she said with a little pant. "It was unnatural and wicked." "Never mind," he said. "It is all over now. And you came to tell me this before the Susan returned. Ah, that was like you, Miss Sartorius. Thank you, thank you. I can't tell you how grateful I am. I am, almost, a happy man now. Poor Lucy. I ought to tell you that I am trying to find out what became of her. But I won't bother you with that. What can I say to show you how grateful I am to you for condescending to come to me like this? Such goodness." He floundered on, his face flushed, his hand pushing his hair from his forehead, in the way she loved, and he did not see, oh, how blind is poor man where woman is concerned, that he had only to take her in his arms, without a word, just take her in his arms. I will go now," she said. I hope that we shall be friends again, Mr. Ware." So humble still, so full of pleading, the sweet voice, and yet he did not see. "Friends? Ah, yes, if you will let me be one," he said gratefully. "I shall not be here long, but while I am here, I am glad you have come back to the court. How funny it is that you should know the Harlings. Did they tell you how we met? I am painting Miss Grace's picture. When I've finished that, and got to the bottom of poor Lucy Hawker's case, I shall be off. You know my old love of adventure." "I know," she said almost inaudibly. "I hope you will be happy. I will go now." She turned to the door. He followed her and opened it. "To come to me like this," he murmured almost to himself. "It is the sweetest, the noblest thing. Oh, I can't realize it." "Yes," said poor Claire in a whisper. And to come for nothing." He looked at her. Her face went almost white, then flamed. Down went the fork which he had unconsciously held all the time, and out went his hand upon her arm. "Miss Sartorius, Claire, stop. You shall not go." For of course she made to fly now. A woman always wants to fly at the first intimation of pursuit. "No, you shall not. Claire, look at me. Speak to me." End of chapters 39 and 40. Chapters 41 and 42 of The Mistress of Court Regna by Charles Garvice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 41. Gerald's hand tightened on Claire's arm, so much so that he almost hurt her, but she did not mind. Indeed, it would have given her a subtle kind of joy to suffer pain at his hand. She had wronged him so. "Claire," he said, and his voice was hurried and broken. "Why did you look at me like that? Can it be possible that— Claire, forgive me, I must be mad. I must be deceiving myself as I did before." She did not offer to withdraw her arm, but stood, her heart beating wildly, her eyes downcast. But suddenly she lifted them and looked at him again, and again her look, half pleading, half tender, and so wistful, shot through him like a warm dart, as Owen Meredith says. "Claire," he said after he had caught his breath, "I love you. I can't help it. I must tell you. I have tried to forget you, to harden my heart against you, but it is of no use. I love you, and I shall always love you till I die. I told you all this before, and you gave me your answer. But I tell it you again, for the last time." She turned her face to him pityingly, wistfully. "Not the last time, Gerald," she whispered in a voice that thrilled through him. "You must tell it to me again and again, because I shall never be tired of hearing it." It was almost too much for him, the suddenness of his joy, the infinite witchery of the tender smile that stole over her lovely face. "Claire, oh, my love," he breathed, and he caught her in his arms and pressed her to him, so that indeed she could scarcely whisper his name. "Tell me once more, dearest," he said. "I can scarcely believe it. Just say, 'Gerald, I love you.'" "Gerald, I love you." "And I will be your wife." She hid her face on his breast. "And I will be your wife." "Claire," after a pause, after he had kissed her lips, her hair, "this isn't, what do you call it, reparation? Ah, no, I know you wouldn't deceive me. You love me, dearest, really and truly. Good heavens, it seems so wonderful. Why should you?" "Because you are Gerald. That is all," she murmured. "Gerald, let me hide my face for shame. Don't look at me just yet. There, turn your face away, dearest." She put her hands to his face caressingly, and averted it. How can I say it? I came to tell you. I came to ask you to take me. I could not have gone away. I could not. I should have fallen at your feet and prayed you to have pity on me." "Claire!" he gasped. "Yes. Think, dearest. I had wronged you so cruelly, and I loved you all the time. And my pride and jealousy had nearly wrecked my life, and there was no pride left in me, and no self-respect. Gerald, shall I kneel to you now? Shall I say what I meant to say, if you had not guessed and asked me? I should have clung to you and cried, 'Gerald, I love you. I have wronged you. I have been a poor miserable little fool with my pride and my suspicion. But I loved you all the time. Have pity on me. Take me for your wife. You shall do what you like with me, bully me, beat me, anything. Only let me live with you, and try and show you what a woman's love means." She was sobbing now half hysterically, and he, half frightened and trembling almost as much as she, soothed her with a lover's whispered word, the lover's touch. "Hush, hush, dearest. These are not words for you, my queen. It is I who should kneel." He sunk on his knees and drew her hand to his face. She stooped and raised him. No, here, on my heart, Gerald," she panted. "And you haven't had your breakfast," she exclaimed a moment or two later. "Breakfast? No, not yet. Have you?" She shook her head, and tried to smooth the hair his caresses had ruffled.
No, I came out. The house seemed stifling, and I was restless, to inquire after you." "Have some with me," he said joyously. "Shall I?" she said wistfully, shyly. "Why not?" he responded. "See, I'll make some more tea. It's got cold." "And I'll do the toast. Let me, Gerald." "There's some eggs somewhere," he exclaimed, rushing about, laughing without knowing it. "Where's the butter?" "Am I awake or dreaming? Stand still a moment and let me look at you." She drew herself up and let his eyes wander over her. "Yes, it is you," he said with a long breath. "Now don't come near me, or we shall never get any breakfast. There's the bread, and, oh, here are the eggs, I remember. Oh, yes, after all, I must be dreaming, don't you know? I shall wake up presently and find that you have gone, and that I am still hungering and aching for you." "I'd better give you something more substantial to eat, and quickly," she said with a laugh, and the laugh was like sweet wholesome music in the little room. They got breakfast, after several interruptions and interludes, and both discovered that they were hungry. It was scarcely proper, perhaps, for these two alone to be seated opposite each other like man and wife, but they had no thought and very little care for the proprieties of that moment. He had got his love, his life's angel at last, and all the rest didn't matter. And she, well, if all the world cried shame, she would not have cared. He was hers, her very own, and nothing should come between them again. They talked after a while, and Claire told him of the Sapleys' nice little plot and Mr. Harling's goodness. Gerald was amazed, but understood in a moment. "Good heavens!" he exclaimed. "The villains! Well, I might have suspected it. And that dear old fellow. But Claire," his brows knitted perplexedly, Can you accept?" Claire leaned her head on her hand. "All night I have been asking myself that question," she said. "It was hard to answer. At one moment I felt that I could not, at another that perhaps I ought, that I could, perhaps, take it as a loan. But now I haven't to decide, thank heaven." "You haven't? Why not?" he asked. She blushed and lowered her eyes, then raised them and looked at him with a woman's complete surrender. "Because there is someone else who decides everything for me now, and I leave it to him. It is delightful. Interruption and interlude. Well, I don't know what to say. For one thing, of course, I should be glad if you hadn't a penny in the world, because then I should have to work for you. Think of it, dearest. But that's selfish, I know." "You couldn't be selfish if you tried," she remarked with solemn decision. "Oh, couldn't I?" he retorted. "You wait and see. Well, we'll talk it over with him. They are the nicest, most warm-hearted people in all the world. I am fond of him as if he were my father, and of Grace as if she were—" He caught a sudden expression in her face. "What's the matter now?" he asked. "Say sister, Gerald," she said. "I was going to say sister," he said innocently. She nodded. "I don't mind your loving her as a sister," she said very quietly. "Why, of course not," he exclaimed. "You like her too, don't you?" "Yes, like a sister also," she said. "Gerald, you must come up to the court and tell them." "After breakfast," he nodded. "Some more tea, please." Then suddenly, in the midst of their wonderful happiness, Claire remembered where they were. She put her cup down and looked at him pitifully. "Oh, Gerald, that poor girl, Lucy." His face grew grave. "Yes," he said, "I've got to carry that business through. You must help me, dearest." "It seems so heartless to be so happy in this house," she said in a low voice. He got up and comforted her, of course. "We are doing her no wrong, dearest," he said. "Our joy cannot injure or insult her. But come, we will go at once. Let me put your hat on for you. Which is the right side? Or doesn't it matter? There. Oh, Claire, how lovely you are. Would to God I were more worthy of you." "Don't say that, Gerald," she almost implored. "Never say that again.
It makes me think of the way I have treated you, and that hurts me," and she clung to him with a little shudder. They went out and walked demurely enough up the street, for the Regna folk were about and eager to welcome her, but when they got into the lonely lanes their hands stole together and clasped, and they went along like two children sweethearting. Mr. Harling and Grace were on the steps looking for them, and Grace turned rather pale for a moment as she saw them coming along together. But it was only a moment, and it was her last time of showing any emotion at sight of Gerald. "Oh, here you are," exclaimed Mr. Harling. "Grace declared that you had bolted back to London and the school, but I knew you were too sensible to do that. How are you, lad?" and he wrung Gerald's hand. "You two have found each other then, eh?" he asked, looking at them shrewdly. "Yes," said Gerald, drawing Claire's arm within his. "I have found her never to lose her again, I hope." "That's all right, then," cried the old gentleman, chuckling and rubbing his hands. "Come in to breakfast." We've had our breakfast," faltered poor Claire, going rosy red. Mr. Harling laughed with keen enjoyment. "Of course you have. Nice behavior of one's hostess, I must say, to run away and leave her guests to breakfast by themselves." "No, you are the host here," said Claire in a low voice. "Don't you make such a ridiculous mistake, my dear young lady," he retorted. "Court Regna is yours, and no one else's. I hope Gerald has persuaded you to look at the matter in a sensible way. I'm not so sure that you are so much indebted to me as you think. My lawyer has got to examine the Sapley's claims, and I shouldn't be at all surprised when he does so, if he finds that roguery has been at work, and that a good slice will have to be deducted. That will leave you something of an income, and the estate, properly managed, will clear itself in time. That is, of course, if you insist upon repaying me. But I'm not so sure that you will, presently." He nodded and smiled rather mysteriously. "But don't let us worry about money on such a day as this. Let us be happy." "We certainly shan't if we talk about money," interrupted Grace, who, with her arm round Claire's waist, was going round the hall looking at the portraits and curios. "No, I propose, if I may venture to do so, that Miss Sartoris takes us all for a drive and shows us something at least of her kingdom by the sea. The dog-cart, and you shall drive. Claire is a splendid whip, sir," said Gerald. Claire blushed and laughed. "Very well," she said, "we will take a holiday today, but tomorrow I must go back to London. I mustn't run away from them without a word, must I? Miss Gover, oh, you don't know how kind she has been to me. And Sister Agnes, I must go and tell her everything." "Sister Agnes?" echoed Gerald with astonishment. "Do you know her?" "I live with her, did live with her," said Claire in a low voice. "She has been I cannot tell you what she has been to me. No mother could have been more loving, more—" Her eyes filled with tears. Gerald stared at her. "Why, Sister Agnes, a white-haired lady with sad-looking eyes? But of course it must be the same. Why, I know her. I met her. Oh, I must tell you all about it." He did so, leaning over the back of the dog-cart as Claire drove them through the familiar lanes and across the downs, from whence they could look down on the sea stretching away to Labrador. "I don't wonder at your loving her," he said in a low voice. "I can't tell you the impression she made on me. I can't explain it to myself. It was as if—oh, I can't explain. Claire, dearest, do you think she would—" "I know what you are going to say," she murmured. "I think I know your thoughts before you utter them, dear. You think she might come down here." "Yes. How would it be if I ran up to town and persuaded her to come back with me?" "You might," said Claire, "if you told her I wanted her very much." "I'll try it," he said. "I'll go up tomorrow. And I'll go and see that Miss Gover. Fancy your teaching in a school, Claire. Doesn't it sound like a dream?" "And you must make her promise to come down in the holidays." "Oh, Gerald!" And she swung round with an eager flush on her face. "If we could get her down here, to the school, you know. The mistress has talked of retiring for ever so long. Miss Gover would be so happy in the country, and it would be so delightful to have her near us." They made a long drive of it, and Mr. Harling was duly impressed by the extent and wealth of the estate. "Yes," he said to Claire, rubbing his chin, "you ought to be able to repay me, if you want to." After lunch Mr. Harling and Grace disappeared, and Gerald and Claire went out alone. As if they were drawn there by a common impulse, they went to the chapel, and stood beside the tomb, looking down at it hand in hand, with love hovering over them. "Do you remember?" he whispered, as if she had forgotten. "I fell in love with you that first morning, Claire. Do you remember the sketch?" "Yes," she said. "Where is it? Oh, I hope you have kept it, Gerald." "Yes, here it is," he said. And he drew the pencil portrait from his pocket and gave it to her. Her face crimsoned, and she uttered a little cry of surprise and delight. "Oh, how wicked of you! And how sweet of you! But it isn't like me. It's too flattering. Gerald, I must have it." "I think not," he said decisively. "Ask me for the half of my kingdom and it is yours, but not this. Stay, I'll make a bargain with you. I'll give it you when you give me the original. It shall be my wedding present, Claire. I shan't be able to buy you gold or gems, but this is the most precious thing I've got, and I'll give it to you to show how much I love you." Interlude and pause. It was the only allusion he made to his poverty, his inferiority in the matter of wealth and position, but Claire noticed it. "Gerald," she said, creeping very close to him and taking the edge of his coat timidly. If you'd rather I should give up the court and go back to the school, or "Let me work for you," he said eagerly. Then he shook his head. "Dearest, it is like you to propose it, but I've no right to demand such a sacrifice. Besides, I am not ashamed of your wealth or my poverty. If I were rich and you were poor, you would not let that come between us." "No, no, no," she said. "I would marry you if you were King Cophetua and I were the beggar maid." "How clever you are to put it that way, Gerald." They sat long over dinner, and Gerald, of course, found it hard to tear himself away. Saying good night in the semi-darkness of one of the recesses in the hall was a prolonged business. But at last he whispered the last words, coaxed for his last kiss, and went homeward suffused with love and happiness. It was a beautiful night, with the moon at the full, and Gerald, naturally enough, considering his condition, was loath to go in. He thought he would climb up to the cliff before doing so, and turning off from the road just outside the village took the narrow footpath. As he stopped for a moment to light his pipe, he saw a man coming along the downs at right angles with the path. The moon was partially obscured, and for a moment or two Gerald did not recognize him. But presently, when the light was clearer, he saw that it was Mordaunt Sapely. He wore a thick pea-jacket, and its collar was turned up so that it nearly hid the wearer's face, and yet it was by no means a cold night. He was walking quickly and yet cautiously, and he glanced round now and again watchfully. Gerald thought the dress and manner curious, and being now naturally suspicious of Mordaunt, drew back under the shadow of the cliff, and waited until Mordaunt had gone on ahead. Then, cautiously and noiselessly, he followed him. 42. Mordaunt had taken his father to their old house, which perhaps, with a vague presentiment of some such reverse as this which had befallen him, he had left in the hands of a caretaker. Before they had reached the house, Mordaunt realized the gruesome fact that his father's mind had given way under the shock. He was almost mad himself, for he knew that his career, in Downshire at any rate, was over, his ambitious projects blighted and destroyed. Even if Claire and Mr. Harling and Gerald were silent, the servants would not hold their tongues. In a few hours the story of the Sapleys' discomfiture would be spread far and wide. He would not dare to show his face in public. If he ventured to address a meeting he would be hooted from the platform. His career was ended, and he recognized the fact at once. The shock was hard to bear, but another sentiment besides disappointment lessened and deadened it. He had been beaten in the matter of Court Regna. His luck was changing. How about his dread secret buried beneath the sand below the cliff? He paced his room, the room adjoining his father's, where the old man lay chuckling and muttering under the delusion that he had still got the court within his clutches, paced it like a tiger newly caught and trapped, and faced the situation. There was only one thing to be done: to buy that accursed bundle and Jenks' silence, to get together the money he and his father possessed, and leave England. He would be very rich, the court mortgage sum alone was very large. In another country he could climb to the social ladder again. But the first thing was to get Jenks out of the way. He had put off the meeting night after night for reasons which can easily be understood. He dreaded, loathed, having to look at, touch the bundle, to have to speak of the dead girl. But he could put it off no longer. It was too late that night, but he would go tomorrow. He threw himself on his bed as the dawn crept into the window, but he could not sleep. Court Regna gone, his life's ambition wrecked, and all in a few hours. As he tossed from side to side, he cursed Claire, Gerald, even his father, with the impotent, unreasoning fury of a thwarted villain. The next day he looked into his affairs, and took steps to realize all the property he and his father possessed, and, bitterest task of all, sent in his resignation of the candidature to the local committee. He gave for an excuse for his withdrawal the fact of his father's sudden and dangerous illness. He was occupied the whole day, and ate nothing, keeping himself going by occasional drinks of stiff brandy and water, and at night, with burning head and whirling brain, he stole out of the house and stealthily made his way to the cliff. As he stole along the familiar path he paused now and again, and caught his breath and shuddered. He could almost fancy that the wraith of the murdered girl was gliding along by his side, and once, as a seagull flew over his head shrieking, he had hard work to suppress a scream, for it seemed to him as if it were Lucy's voice as it had risen in its piteous cry at the moment he thrust her over. A light was burning in Jenks' hut, and he crept up to the window and peered in. The man was sitting by the fire smoking, and a devilish longing jumped into Mordaunt's heart. How if he stole in behind the man and— But he put it away from him with a shudder, and tapped at the window. Jenks rose and opened the door, and did not show the least surprise at the visit. "Oh, here you are, Mr. Mordaunt," he said stolidly. "I thought as how you'd turn up one of these nights. Come in and sit down, Mr. Mordaunt. Sorry I haven't anything to offer you." Mordaunt stood and looked at him, and then round the hut furtively. "I have no time to waste. Have you done as I told you?" "Yes, and had to stand no end to drinks on the strength of that old rich uncle of mine. I could leave here tomorrow, tonight for that matter, and they wouldn't think it queer." "Good," said Mordaunt. "I have brought the money. Give me—" He moistened his lips and looked round with a shiver. "Give me the bundle." "Right you are, sir," said Jenks cheerfully. "Where's the money, sir? Notes or shiners?" "Notes, notes," replied Mordaunt impatiently. "Did you think I could get so large a sum in gold, man?" "Notes," said Jenks doubtfully. "Don't fancy them somehow. Easy to trace, ain't they?" "For heaven's sake, don't wear out my patience," Mordaunt interrupted. "Give me the cursed thing and let me go. I will meet you at Liverpool tomorrow and see you off. Not that I am afraid." "Oh, no, only just in the way of kindness, of course," said Jenks placidly. "I'll get the bundle." He dragged a sea-chest from the wall, and with an old wood chopper lifted the flooring boards, and flung the bundle on the table. Mordaunt started back with a low cry and an oath, and stood looking at the things as if they were alive and were crying, "Murderer! Murderer!" Jenks stared at him. "You look bad, Mr. Mordaunt," he said. "Blessed if you don't look worse than you did when you chucked her over the cliff, or when you were piling the sand atop of her down there on the sand slip." Mordaunt shuddered. "Curse you! Hold your tongue," he said hoarsely, and looking around fearfully. "Do you want any one to hear you shout?" "Oh, I ain't afraid," said Jenks, "but I begs your pardon. I ain't given to whispering, you see. Howsomever, there's the bundle, and I'm off tomorrow the first train. Now for them notes, Mr. Mordaunt.
Lord, to think of my happening to be in that part of the beat that night, and chancing to see you chuck Lucy over. She cried out awful, didn't she? Shouldn't make a rich man of me. Wonderful the ways of Providence, ain't they, Mr. Mordaunt?"
Mordaunt took some notes from his pocket-book and some gold from his purse.
"You understand," he said thickly. "You will keep your promise. But you dare not come back. Remember what I told you. You are an accessory after the fact, and run the same risk as I do." "Right you are, Mr. Mordaunt. I've been thinking that over, and I've been tempted more than once, especially since Mr. Ware came back, to turn, what do you call it, Queen's evidence, and I'm not sure that it wouldn't be my best plan."
Mordaunt waved his hand impatiently, then stretched it out toward the bundle.
"What are you going to do with it?"
asked Jenks, as serenely as if he were referring to a piece of old sailcloth. Mordaunt wiped the sweat from his white and haggard face.
"Throw it in the black pool," he said. "There was a pool near the jetty, formed by a circle of rocks, which held the tide for a depth of 10 or 12 feet.
Jenks shook his head.
"Better burn it," he said. "Burn it here. I'll make up the fire."
Mordaunt paused, irresolute. He would have to stand by and see the bundle untied, to watch while it was gradually consumed. It was beyond his power of endurance.
"No," he said, I cannot. It will sink with stones to the bottom of the pool."
He took up the bundle. It shook in his hand.
"Open the door," he said hoarsely.
Jenks lurched round the table, but before he could reach the door it opened, and Gerald stood on the threshold. Mordaunt dropped the bundle and uttered a shriek. Jenks started back, looked from one to the other, and with stolid sang-froid said,
"Too late. I'm blessed if it ain't Mr. Ware. No, Mr. Mordaunt, I shouldn't take your money." He wagged his head toward the notes and gold. "I told you just now that I should turn Queen's evidence, that it wasn't no use asking me to destroy that there bundle."
Mordaunt, mad with rage at the man's duplicity and a change of front, caught up the axe and dashed at him. Gerald flung himself between them and caught Mordaunt's arm just in time to avert the blow from Jenks, and gripped Mordaunt tightly. Despair, near akin to madness, will endow a man with the strength of a fiend. Though he was not nearly so strong as Gerald, Mordaunt wrestled with him with desperate persistence, and once Gerald was underneath. A pair of pistols hung over the fireplace, and Jenks snatched one down and fired it outside the door, then he came in and stood philosophically looking on at the fight. At last Gerald mastered the frenzied man, and pinning him to the ground with his knee looked over his shoulder at Jenks. "Give me a rope, anything to tie his hands."
"No, no," gasped Mordaunt. I surrender."
"Get up," said Gerald sternly. Mordaunt shuffled to his feet and leaned against the mantelpiece, panting and shaking and eyeing the two men like a trapped wolf.
That man is a liar," he gasped. "A liar and a vulgar common scoundrel. He enticed me here with a cock and bull story about Lucy Hawker."
"Silence," said Gerald. "I was outside. I heard every word. I followed you here."
"My God, and it was you who killed Lucy."
"Silence. Remember that every word you say must be repeated. You killed Lucy." Mordaunt glared at him sideways.
"Keep your threats for those who fear them," he said thickly. "I am in your power. What do you intend to do?"
"Hand you over to the police," said Gerald grimly. He turned to Jenks. "Jenks, go down and bring up a constable. I will wait here."
"Aye, aye, sir,"
said Jenks cheerfully, and he went out.
"He will escape," said Mordaunt between his teeth.
But almost as he spoke, Jenks came back, accompanied by a couple of coastguards who had heard the pistol shot. "I charge this man, Mordaunt Sapley, with the murder of Lucy Hawker," said Gerald sternly. "You will take him to the police station at Thraxton. We will go down to the village and get a vehicle." The coastguards stationed themselves on either side of Mordaunt. He leaned against the mantel-shelf and pointed to his cap, and one of the men picked it up for him and threw it to him. He put it on and turned to the glass, and in doing so stealthily whipped the remaining pistol from its place and thrust it in his breast. The action was so rapidly, so smoothly done that no one noticed it, for they were all talking together in an excited undertone. "Go on," said Gerald, and with Mordaunt between them the two coastguards led the way. "Glad you came up, Mr. Ware," began Jenks, but Gerald stopped him. "You had better hold your tongue until you appear before the magistrates," he said significantly. "Right you are, sir," assented Jenks, and then followed the prisoner in silence. As they drew near the village, lights began to flash about the houses, and they heard the murmur of voices, and at the head of the street they were met by a crowd of fishermen and women. "What's up?" demanded one, raising his lantern, and the others gathered round. "Why, it's Mr. Mordaunt. Whatever's happened to him?" "It's a bad business, mates," said one of the coastguards. "Yes," said Jenks. "We found the man as run off with Lucy Hawker. It was Mr. Mordaunt here." A cry of astonishment ran round the crowd. "Mr. Mordaunt? What's he done with her?" "Mr. Mordaunt? Why, it ain't possible." They pressed forward, their eager faces shining in the light of the lanterns. "You'll know presently, so I may as well tell you," said Jenks. "He pitched her over the cliff the night she was thought to have run away. Pitched her over the west cliff and buried her afterward in the sand-slip just below." A cry of horror rose from the group, followed by a groan and a yell of rage. Mordaunt shrunk nearer the coastguards and clutched one of their arms. It's a lie," he gasped. "He says it's a lie," said a man. "Answer, Jenks. The truth. The truth." "It's true enough," said Jenks stolidly. "I see him. He came up tonight and offered me money." "A lie!" shrieked Mordaunt. The men talked together excitedly and swayed to and fro for a moment in wild confusion. Then one cried out, "Mates, it's easily proved. Let's go and see. Bring him along, you chaps." "No, no," said Gerald. "He is my prisoner. I order him to be taken to Thraxton." But he felt that he was powerless to oppose them. "Don't you interfere with me, Mr. Ware," growled one of the men. "We'll prove the truth of it. Bring him along, or we'll tear him from ye." Resistance was useless, and Gerald signed his consent. Mordaunt clung to the nearest coastguard. "No, no!" he shrieked. "I will not go. I demand protection. Take me to the police." A sullen roar arose, and a fisherman sprung forward. "Bring him along, or we will," he said with an oath. Surrounded by the excited mob, which increased at every step, Mordaunt was led down the street and round the rocks to the strip of sand. By the time it was reached he was almost incapable of standing, and one of the guards grabbed him by the arm and so supported him. Jenks measured the slip with his eye. "There's the spot," he said. A man had gone into a cottage and snatched up a spade, and he began to dig. But the crowd could not wait, and some of them went down on their knees and tore at the sand with their knives. Presently one of them uttered a low cry. He had discovered a portion of a woman's dress. The spectators echoed the cry with a moan of terrible suspense and excitement, and the man with the spade worked more carefully. As each shovelful of sand was thrown up, Mordaunt shuddered, and clung more tightly to the coastguard, and presently, as a deep sob rose from the crowd, followed by a yell and then an awful silence, he sunk on to the ground. "It's her! It's Lucy! Oh, my God!" shouted a woman, throwing her arms above her head. Screams and oaths rent the air, and Gerald, fearing that Mordaunt would be lynched, torn from limb to limb, flung himself in front of him. "Stand back," he said. "He is in the hands of the law. Justice will be done. Stand back." As he spoke, half a dozen men threw themselves upon him and pinioned him, and one man, it was the young fisherman William, sprung upon Mordaunt and dragged him to the open grave. "Look at your work, you devil!" he cried hoarsely. "Look at it!" And he forced Mordaunt's face down. The wretched man screamed with terror and wound himself round the legs of his captor. "Spare me! Spare me! Don't kill me!" he shouted. "I'll confess! Don't kill me!" and he writhed upon the sand like a wounded snake. The man spurned him with his foot. "Get up, you murdering dog," he said hoarsely. "We won't kill 'ee. We'll leave that to the hangman. Stand back, mates. Let no one touch him. Leave him to Mr. Ware. He'll see that justice is done by'n. Oh, Lucy! Oh, my God!" And he covered his face with his hands. Gerald sprung forward and stood right across Mordaunt. "You hear?" he said, for the crowd with white wolfish faces still threatened. "William's right. Leave him to the law. It will avenge poor Lucy." The crowd groaned sullenly. "Let's bury him with her," said one in a hoarse whisper. But Mordaunt heard, and a scream of agony rose from his white lips. They saw him turn over writhingly, and thrust his hand in his breast. Then a sharp report rang out, and a tongue of flame shot forth, and with another shriek he rolled over on his face. There was an intense silence for an instant, a silence that seemed more hideous than the din which had preceded it. Gerald sprung aside, then bent over the prostrate figure. The crowd gathered round, and one of the coastguards knelt and placed his hand on Mordaunt's heart. "He's dead," he said solemnly. "He's shot himself." The line of white faces and staring eyes above which the moonlight fell placidly started back, and a cry of disappointment rose. "Curse him! He's done us after all," said a voice. "He's give us the slip." Gerald held up his hand. "No," he said solemnly. "He stands before the great judge, my men, and he will do justice." End of chapters 41 and 42. Chapter 43 of The Mistress of Court Regna by Charles Garvice. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. 43. The scene at the double inquest was a terrible one. Women wept and shrieked, and men groaned and clinched their hands tightly as Jenks told his story. It all seemed so clear now, and they were amazed that their suspicions had never been directed toward Mordaunt. Many of them remembered having seen him and Lucy together, but his duplicity had been so fiendishly perfect that he had deceived them all. The jury wanted to bring in a verdict of murder against Mordaunt, and consign him to a suicide's grave, and it was with difficulty that the coroner could persuade the 12 stern white-faced men to return the usual verdict. The only unmoved person in the court was Jenks. He gave his evidence in his usual stolid fashion, every now and then fingering and looking down at his empty pipe, and he was not even surprised when the coroner had him arrested as an accessory after the fact. It may be added in parenthesis that he was equally unmoved when, later on, the judge sentenced him to 7 years' penal servitude for his passive share in Mordaunt's dastardly crime. When the painful scene was over, and Gerald made his way from the stuffy room in which the inquest had been held, surrounded by a crowd eager now to congratulate and make a hero of him, he became suddenly faint and queer. Gerald was an exceedingly strong man, as we know, but he had gone through a great deal lately, and the scene of the inquest, following upon the still more terrible one on the sands, had in common parlance got upon his nerves. He got away from the crowd at last, and went home feeling sick, and to his surprise was actually sick. Mr. Harling and Claire, coming in search of him, found him white and shaking, and in a state of collapse. And though Gerald tried to make light of his condition, Mr. Harling insisted upon his going to bed and sending for the doctor. "It's all nonsense," said Gerald. "I'm just a little upset, and shall be all right presently. I want to go back to the court with you and Claire. I don't want to go to bed." But of course he had to go, and the doctor, when he came, blandly but firmly insisted upon his remaining there. Claire, of course, wanted to stay and nurse him. But Gerald would not hear of this, and a woman volunteered to act in that capacity. Strange to say, the woman who had been most violent against him when he had first come back to Regna, and had been surrounded by an accusing mob. But Claire spent a great deal of the day beside him, holding his hand in that silence which, to persons in their happy condition, speaks so much and so sweetly. Perhaps Gerald's sudden illness was a blessing in disguise, for it kept all our friends from dwelling upon the terrible events of the last few days. The whole place was in excitement, not only on account of the murder, but over the return of Miss Sartoris, and the destruction of the cunning plot by which the Sapleys had sought to obtain Court Regna and the estates. Old Sapley was mercifully unconscious of his son's crime and its dramatic punishment, and would remain ignorant to the end of his life. The doctors pronounced him incurably insane, and he had been removed to a private asylum where, surrounded by comfort, he spent the time in going over imaginary accounts, and informing the doctors and nurses, and anyone who would listen to him, that he was the master of Court Regna, and that Mr. Mordaunt Sapley, who was the member of the county, was his son. Claire and Mr. Harding went, at Grace's request, to see him. The visit was a painful one to them, but not to him, for he had no recollection of them, and told them the story of his triumph with imbecile chuckles and gloating enjoyment. "My son's a clever man," he said. "There's no knowing what he'll rise to. He's in the House, you know, and they'll be sure to give him office. He'll be in the Cabinet some day, and he'll marry a noblewoman. Shouldn't be surprised if they made him a peer. He'll be Lord Sapley. No, that ain't good enough. Why shouldn't he take the old title, the title that went with the place that's his now? Yes, he shall be Earl Wharton, Lord Wharton of Court Regna." Claire went away weeping, for the sight of the old man and his insane triumph wiped out any feeling of resentment she might have harbored against the man who had caused her and Gerald so much unhappiness. One afternoon Gerald, waking from an uneasy sleep, saw a dark-robed figure sitting beside the bed. It reminded him of Sister Agnes, but he thought he must be dreaming, and he stretched out his hand and laid it on her arm. It was Sister Agnes, and she turned her pale, sad face on him with a gentle smile. "You are awake?" she said in her soft, placid voice. "I suppose so," he assented rather doubtfully. "But is it really you, sister?" "Yes, it is I." "That's funny," he said. "I've thought of you a great deal, and I dreamed of you last night. Why did you come?" "Because you had need of me," she said. "How did you know?" he asked. "Claire wrote and told me you were ill. Something bid me. I felt that I must come." "It's very good of you," he said. "And I am very glad. Are you going to stay?" he asked wistfully. "Yes," she replied. "I have sent the woman away. I am going to nurse you." "You won't have to nurse me very long," he said. "I'm quite well, only a little shaky about the pins, and I'm longing to get up." "You shall get up when you're well enough," she said. "Ah," he said, "I see by the tone that I've got a real nurse now. There's no one so tyrannical and overbearing. But don't you think I'm a poor and unprotected male? There's Claire. She'll take my part. I suppose she has told you that I'm her sweetheart, and that we're going to be married?" "Yes, she has told me," said Sister Agnes, gently forcing him to lie down again, for in his eagerness he had got up on his elbow. "And I am very glad. You will have the sweetest wife, the best and truest woman." "Now that's unfair," said Gerald. "You're speaking my part. Sister, there isn't another woman like her in the wide world, and if you'll kindly help me to get out of this foolish bed and marry her out of hand, I shall owe you a lifelong debt of gratitude." As he spoke, Claire entered, and exclaimed with joy and astonishment at the sight of the black-robed figure standing beside him. "Sister Agnes!" she cried, and the sister's arms were round her in a loving embrace, and they were so engrossed in the joy of their meeting that they almost seemed to forget Gerald, until he reminded them of his unworthy existence by remarking confidentially to the ceiling, "I don't appear to be on in this scene." Then Claire turned to him, and with a blushing, "May I?" to the sister, knelt and kissed him. "I wanted you to come," she said to Sister Agnes, "but I did not like to say so in my letter. Gerald was coming up to fetch you. I have so much to tell you, and I want to hear all about the school." Sister Agnes smiled. "I am loaded with messages," she said. "Tiny and all your class send their love. Miss Gover does not send hers." She smiled again, with the first touch of archness in her face that Claire had seen. "She says that if you do not return within 4 days, she will report you to the board, who will doubtless proceed against you for breach of contract. She says that if it's true you have recovered your wealth, it's one of the most unfortunate things she has ever heard of, because you would have made a first-rate teacher, and in time must have risen to the position of head mistress, which Miss Gover says is one of the proudest on earth." "As she will find," said Claire, "when she becomes head mistress of the Court Regna schools, with the schools rebuilt and the prettiest of schoolhouses, planned by Gerald Ware, Esquire, architect, made ready for her." "Isn't she an angel?" demanded Gerald of Sister Agnes. "Miss Gover," said Claire. "Have you only just found that out?" "Ah, I forgot. You do not know her. But you will indeed say so when you make her acquaintance. An angel with the sharpest little eyes, and the sternest little voice, and the tenderest big heart that ever beat in a woman's bosom." "Indeed," remarked Gerald. "I was thinking of another angel." "Meaning me?" said Claire with delicious frankness. "I'm not a bit of an angel. You both know that. I'm only a commonplace young person, dominated by one idea. Yes, a one-ideed person, and Miss Gover says there is nothing more contemptible." "I think I rather like contemptible people, then," said Gerald. "And may I ask what that idea is?" Claire grew rosy red and shook her head. "Not before Sister Agnes," she said. And Sister Agnes, who might have been expected to chide their levity, sat and regarded them with a tender smile upon her placid lips, and a deep light of protecting love in her grey eyes. "You must make him quite well very soon, sister," said Claire, "and bring him to the court. Mr. Harling and Grace, whom you know, are with me, and I can do nothing until he comes, and there is so much to be done." "To the court?" said Sister Agnes in a low voice, the smile fading from her face. She bent her head under the concealing veil, then she looked up steadily and said, "Very well, I will bring him. Go now, my child," and she glanced at Gerald's flushed face. Gerald recovered his strength very quickly under Sister Agnes's care. After the first day, one might almost say the first few minutes, he accepted her devotion, for it was no less, as a matter of course. This way of taking it surprised him himself, but without any volition on his part he had grown to regard her as if she belonged to him, as if he had some special property in her. He could scarcely bear to have her out of his sight, and when he was strong enough to get up, he leaned upon her, not as a man leans upon a nurse, but as a husband leans upon a wife, a son upon his mother. Once or twice, in fact, he addressed her as mother, as he had done on his first meeting with her. And as then she trembled at the word, and her eyes grew moist. Sitting together by the fire, he gradually told her in full the story of his life. It was a wonderful story, and she listened with a sympathy of which he was conscious, though she seldom said a word, contenting herself with now and then laying her thin and wasted hand on his strong one. But of herself and her own life story she said nothing, and Gerald revered her too much to ask a word, though he often regarded her with a silent and almost painful curiosity. One day, after he had been chafing at his enforced inaction and imprisonment, she said quietly, but with a little shake in her voice, "You are well enough to go to the court to-day." "Bravo!" he shouted. "But you must be quiet," she said tenderly. "It is all arranged. A carriage will be at the top of the steps in a quarter of an hour. You can walk thus far." "I could walk 50 miles if Claire were at the end of them," he said joyously, and he would not let her help him to put on his overcoat. "I am going to escape from your clutches from to-day," he said. It was only an affectation of triumph, and he did not mean it, for his heart was full of gratitude. But she winced a little, looking up at him piteously, and he was aghast at the effect of his bantering speech. "Why, I didn't mean it," he said. "You know I didn't. If you could look into my heart, you would see how grateful, how—" He put both hands reverently upon her shoulders. "I know," she said. "It was foolish of me. Perhaps I can look into your heart. Lean on me as you go up the steps, though you may not need to." As they climbed up the quaint and unique village street, the people came out and thronged round them to greet Gerald with affectionate congratulations, and the sister with respect and gratitude. No one looking at the people as they stood round, bareheaded and smiling, would have recognized in them the furious, bloodthirsty mob which a few nights before had threatened to tear Mordaunt Sapley limb from limb. But this is the way with Regna folk. They are as gentle as lambs and as responsive to affection as women. But rouse their wrath and indignation, and the lamb becomes a tiger, and the woman a fury. Claire and Grace were waiting in the carriage, and it is difficult to say which of the girls, in their respective ways, made more fuss over Gerald and his nurse. As they drove to the court, along the cliff road down which Claire had ridden on her way to the chapel that morning long ago, and through the lanes now bare of leaves, but still beautiful with the promise of another spring, and up the wide avenue with its lines of towering elms, Sister Agnes was very silent. She leaned back with her arms folded across her bosom, her face concealed behind the veil, so that the others could not see that her lips were moving in that silent prayer which reaches heaven more quickly than any flood of eloquence. Her face was pale, and it quivered with some emotion when Mr. Harling met them on the steps and was made known to her. Grace fell in love with her at once, and indeed it seemed as if this sad-faced woman in her black robe of mercy and self-renunciation were the central figure, for that day at least. She stood in the hall with Claire on one side of her, and Gerald on the other, and looked round with a sad and thoughtful gaze, as if the sight of the place aroused a sentiment more profound than curiosity and admiration. They went into lunch, and the young people were very bright and almost merry, for Gerald was throbbing with the excitement of newly regained health, and the delight of being near his beloved, and Grace, upon whom the famous air of Downshire had wrought a marked improvement, was in possession of all her natural esprit. The shadow of the Sapleys and their evil doings was already passing away from the ancient house, upon which the sun of happiness and youthful love was again rising. They talked and laughed, but were not forgetful of their two elders, who sat and spoke together in graver tones, and Gerald would now and again turn, with a word and a smile of tender regard, to the white patient woman beside him. "We want to show you all over the court after lunch, sister," said Claire. "Gerald, who knows it all by this time, shall act as cicerone, and point out its lions." As she spoke she bent and kissed her. It was delightful to have her at Court Regna, and to know that she was resting from her life of toil amongst the poor, of whom none had suffered more keenly than she herself. After lunch Gerald led them into the hall, and assuming the air of a guide, rapidly indicated the various objects of interest and epitomized their history. "But the pictures," he said, "are, perhaps, Miss Sartoras's," with a mock bow to Claire, "most valuable and priceless possessions. If you will step this way, we will proceed to view the family portraits of the Wharton family." He changed his slightly burlesque tone to a more serious one as he ran over the portraits, and naturally enough drew the sister's arm within his. "This," he said gravely, "is the portrait of the last Lord Wharton." As he spoke he felt the arm tremble and the frail body sway. Mr. Harling, who had been standing near with his observant eye upon her, stepped forward quickly and took her other hand. Before anyone could speak, she had recovered herself and stood looking at the portrait with a mask-like face and unfathomable eyes. She looked at that moment like one of the pictures stepped from its frame. "You are tired," said Gerald. "We will rest." "No," she said in a low voice but quite firmly. "Let us go on, please." Gerald drew her arm through his still more closely, and they went along the corridor and to the end of the body of the building. "There is an old wing here," said Gerald, "which Claire would like to show you. It is the wing I was at work upon, but we will see it some other day." "I would like to see it now," she said. Mr. Harling signed to him to withhold any further remonstrance, and Claire unlocking the dividing door, they passed into the room which had just escaped demolition. "Is it not a fine old room?" said Gerald. "It was here that I was at work. Oh, by the way, do you know, Claire, I had quite forgotten the portrait." "What portrait?" asked Claire. "The portrait of the lady we found behind the panel," he said. "Don't you remember? I stuck it back there the day I left, and it must be there still, of course. I should like to show it to the sister and Mr. Harling. May I?" "Why, certainly," whispered Claire. "Why do you ask me? It is all yours." Then aloud, "I'll send for a chisel or something." "No need," he said. "I can get at it with this." And he took out the old knife with which he had hunted, carved, and cut faggots and other things too numerous and too varied to mention, and getting on a chair, removed the panel with ease and took out the picture. "It's none the worse," he said. "Wait till I've dusted it, and you will see how beautiful it is." They all gazed at it, then Mr. Harling uttered an exclamation and glanced at Sister Agnes. She had sunk on one of the ancient chairs, and was looking at the picture with the same set face and unfathomable eyes. They all followed his gaze, and Claire, after a moment or two of silence, said in an awed voice, "Sister, it is like you." Sister Agnes smiled a strange smile. "The portrait is that of a young girl, Claire. I am an old woman." "Still, there is a likeness," said Gerald in a hushed voice. "I see it now. Why did I not notice it when I first saw you? Do you detect it, sir?" Mr. Harling rubbed his chin and looked hard at the floor. "Likenesses are very deceptive, my lad," he said. "Put the picture down. The sister would like to rest here for a little while. Miss Sartoris, if I might take the liberty." "In your own house?" said Claire with a smile. For once he did not contradict her, but went on quietly. "I would suggest that we have our tea here." "I will go and see to it," said Claire. "Come with me, Grace." And linking her arm in Grace's, she ran out of the room, more like a schoolgirl than so important a person as the Mistress of Court Regna. Mr. Harling closed the door after them, and going up to Sister Agnes, laid his hand gently and protectingly on hers. "My dear," he said, "shall I tell him the story of that picture? You know that I have guessed, discovered it. But you yourself do not know all. It has only come to my knowledge very recently. Are you strong enough to hear it?" "Yes," she said in the same tone. Mr. Harling looked at Gerald. "My boy," he said, "be prepared for a surprise, and try to take it as calmly as she, God helping her, will do." Gerald said nothing, but bent his head and stood erect with folded arms. "It was not a whim, Gerald, that took me to that place, Lartree," said Mr. Harling. "I went there to find a sister from whom I had parted when I was a child. She was older than I, and had been a mother to me, and when I came back to England my first thought was of her. I did not find her. I shall not do so till I have crossed the last river. She had married the vicar of the place, and she had died of a broken heart. His heart had broken also, for they had lost their only child, the treasure of their lives. She had not died, but had left them with her lover, and had passed out of their lives as completely as if snatched from them by the hand of death itself. I wanted to find where this daughter, my niece, remember, had gone. And I have." His hand closed on the sister's. The black-robed figure was bowed and motionless. "If you are thinking ill of her, cease to do so. The man she fled with married her. He took her away with him to Italy, and there, deeming her guilty of betraying him, he left her. A child was born. She thought that it had died." His hand closed more firmly on the one he held. "But she was deceived. The boy lived. It was taken from her and placed under the care of a couple in England. He grew up with them to boyhood, and then he ran away from them to sea." Gerald moved slightly and looked from one to the other, but said nothing. "Mother and son were completely ignorant of each other's existence. She came to England at last, and devoted herself to a life of charity. The saints are not all dead yet. She is one of them." His voice broke slightly. "He wandered about the world until it chanced that he came to a place called Regna." Gerald uttered an exclamation under his breath. "Be silent and be calm, my lad," said Mr. Harling, with a warning glance at the figure beside him. "I chanced to meet him at the very place at which his mother was born.
Can you wonder that I started when you told me your name, Gerald? For it was the maiden name of your mother. Where—" Gerald could not repress a cry now. "You," said Mr. Harling, "were her son and my kinsman. The man she married was Lord Wharton. This lady, whom God protect, is Lady Wharton and your mother." There was a profound silence in the room. Then, how he knew not, Gerald was on his knees before her, with his arms straining around her and his head upon her bosom, while sobs of "Mother, my son," broke the solemn silence. Lady Wharton's severe training in the sternest and most severe of schools had endowed her with a marvelous power of self-restraint. And though her whole being was thrilling with that most sacred of all emotions, maternal love, she exerted that power on behalf of the still more shaken and agitated Gerald. She soothed him with word and caress, and in a very few minutes they were sitting hand in hand, with tears on their cheeks, 'tis true, but outwardly calm. "Mother," whispered Gerald, as if the word were the sweetest his lips could frame, and "Gerald, my son," she murmured in response, while Mr. Harling stood at a little distance, with his back turned to them, and his face hidden in his handkerchief. "And you are Lady Wharton," said Gerald. "Think of it, mother, mother." "And you are Lord Wharton," said Mr. Harling, coming up to them. "Think of that." Gerald started. He had in fact not thought of it yet. "Now you see," remarked Mr. Harling dryly, "that you and Claire need make no fuss about my paying the Sapleys' mortgage. I'm your uncle, my boy, or something like it. Shake hands. God bless you, my boy. You little thought, when you fought for Grace's life, that you were risking yours to save your cousin. I'm your kinsman, as I say, and I suppose I'm at liberty to spend some of my money in saving the estates, if I like. It's the first time in my life I've got any real enjoyment out of the pile, excepting when I've been buying something for Grace, and it makes me feel quite glad that I found the butterfly." Gerald wrung his hand. "But they're Claire's estates, you know," he said with a laugh. "They were not entailed, and Lord Wharton—" "Your father," murmured Lady Wharton. "Yes, my father," said Gerald in a low voice, and still wonderingly, "left everything to her, and it was the very best thing he could have done." Then he looked at them gravely. "By the way, sir, He stopped and bit his lip and looked a little troubled. "Couldn't we keep our secret a little longer? I've got my mother, and I don't care a fig for the title. Couldn't we keep it until Claire and I are married? Well, it will be no news to you if I tell you that she's proud. You know that. She wouldn't be my own dear Claire if she were not. If she knows who I am, she will want to hand over the estates, and— Mother, I don't want her to do that. I would rather marry her as we are. She the Mistress of Court Regna, and I just Gerald Ware, quite a nobody, without a title and without a penny." Of course the mother understood instantly. "Yes, keep the secret," she said, looking up at Mr. Harling. He hesitated. "Well, I don't know," he said. "You two will find it precious difficult to hide it. You won't be able to look at each other without having mother and son in your eyes." "We have called each other mother and son," said Lady Wharton tremulously. "Well, well," said Mr. Harling resignedly. "Let the boy have his way. But mark me, Gerald, only till after the wedding. You must take your proper place then. I'm going to take that as my reward for hunting out the truth. I want to see my sister's grandchild in his proper place, the Earl of Wharton. I want to see my niece recognized and righted." Lady Wharton trembled. "I am Sister Agnes," she said. "You are that boy's mother, my dear," he said warmly, "and you owe it to him, to your dead parents' memory, to your family, to take your right place and position." "It shall be as Gerald wishes," she said. "Hush, here they come," said Gerald. "After the wedding. We must be married at once. You must help me to persuade her, mother. Hush."
He had just time to kiss her and move away from her before Claire and Grace came in. They were laughing about something, and were flushed with running up the stairs. Claire went up to Lady Wharton and put her arm round her. "Are you rested, dear?" she said. "Tea's just coming. How happy you look." "I am very happy," said Sister Agnes, and her eyes filled with tears. Gerald went to the window. The footman brought in the tea, and Claire at once began to pour it out. "It was a happy idea of yours, Mr. Harling," she said, "and we'll often have tea here, when it's rebuilt, I mean," she went on, glancing at Gerald. "The architect has returned after a long holiday and is going to resume operations. On the south side he intends building 2 suites of rooms, one of them for some friends of mine, Mr. Harling and his daughter, and the other for a lady who will be kept a close prisoner here. I say a prisoner, because it will only be by chaining her to some article of furniture that we shall be able to keep her from escaping to her dearly beloved slums. However, perhaps we shall be able to find her some poor and dirty people in Regna. Let us hope so." She looked at Sister Agnes bewitchingly, as if she defied her to refuse, and then went on, turning to Gerald. "Oughtn't we to keep this antique furniture, Gerald, just as it is? We want Mary Lexton here, and she is coming in a week or 2. I heard from her this morning. She knows all about furniture, and can spot the genuine antique." "Is that right, Gerald?" "I'm trying to learn all his slang, Mr. Harling, because I find it so much more expressive than ordinary English." "Some of it's very expressive," said Mr. Harling, with a twinkle in his eye. Claire blushed. "Well, I have to make a selection, of course. It's so difficult to tell whether a word's wicked or not. I tried one on Lord Chester yesterday, and he didn't even wince, and it would be so easy to shock him." Gerald looked down at her with a fine smile. "Easy for most people, I dare say," he said, "but some of us are privileged." The colour rose again to Claire's face. She had told Gerald of Lord Chester's offer, and, strange to say, it had not roused his jealousy, but only increased the warmth of his liking for that true nobleman. "Yes," said Claire musingly, "we will let Mary loose on the furniture, as Gerald would say, and she shall arrange it just as she pleases. It will be delightful to see her trying to drag that old bureau about, for instance," and she nodded at it. Gerald started. "By Jove," he said, "that reminds me," and he began fumbling in his pocket. It was full of papers and sketches, and they all watched him with the faint amusement and enjoyment with which we all watch a man hunting for something. "Oh, here it is," he said at last, and he held up an envelope. "Do you remember my finding some papers that had been left in that old bureau, Claire?" She shook her head. "Oh, but you must." "If you say so, I do," she said, with so meek a smile on her lovely face that Grace laughed. "I gave them to you, and you gave them back to me to take care of, or give to Mr. Sapley, I forget which." "And you have taken care of them in a man's usual way," said Mr. Harling. "If you want to forget anything, if you want to lose a letter, for instance, give it to a man to post. I've carried one about in my pocket already stamped, for months." "I've carried these about for months," said Gerald. "I put them into this envelope, meaning to post them. Then I thought I'd bring it myself. That's what brought me back to Court Regna," he added with a simplicity that made Lady Wharton smile and the rest laugh. "It is fearfully dirty, the envelope I mean, but there it is at last." Claire took it. "It looks as if it had been carried about by the wandering Jew," she said lightly. "I suppose they'll turn out to be nothing more interesting than old bills or receipts." She looked at her name written by his hand with the look which only a woman in love can wear, then she daintily opened the envelope. Gerald had beckoned Lady Wharton to the window, and was talking to her in a low voice, when Claire rose with a faint exclamation. They turned and saw her standing with 2 faded papers in her hand. Her face was white, and there was a startled expression in her eyes. She looked round the group, then holding out the papers a little, she said in a low voice, "You have not read these?" "But of course not." "Can you guess what they are?" "No, you cannot." "This is Lord Wharton's will." "Lord Wharton's will?" Mr. Harling said quickly. "Yes. said Claire, looking at him with a strange light in her eyes. Women are quick to grasp a great truth, quicker even than men when the fact closely touches those they love. This is his will, his last will. I know the date of that which he made in my favor. This is," she glanced at the paper, 2 years later." They held their breath. "And?" asked Mr. Harling comprehensively. "No, it does not leave Court Regna to me," said Claire. "I knew it. He told me almost with his last breath that he had not done so. This will, see it is all in a few lines, leaves everything, excepting a provision for me, to his son." Gerald and Mr. Harling exchanged glances. Lady Wharton stood with her arms folded across her bosom, patient and calm. "To his son," continued Claire in a hushed voice. "Gerald, where? Gerald, is it you?" He went and put his arms round her. She put both her hands, with the papers in them, on his breast, and looked at him, her breath coming fast. Something like dread mingled with the amazement in her eyes. "I am Lord Wharton's son, dear," he said. She laughed. It was a little hysterical. "You are Lord Wharton, the Earl of Wharton," she breathed. "I am Lord Wharton, Claire," he said, "but it is not proven yet." "Yes," she said, and the hand that held the smaller paper fluttered on his breast. "This is the certificate of your birth. He must have put it with the will that there might be no doubt, no difficulty. Take them, Gerald. Everything is yours." She laughed, still a little hysterically, and her hand seemed to close on him clingingly. "Oh, I am so glad, so glad. You are Lord Wharton. Think of it, Gerald. I am so glad and so proud. And I have been robbing you all this time. But I give it all back to you now, dear. Everything." She seemed to divine by the silence that her surprise was not shared wholly by the others, and she looked over her shoulder at them. "Why, you knew it, sister." Gerald drew Lady Wharton forward. "You have given me Court Regna, dearest," he said, and the tears that shone in his eyes were no shame to his manhood. "Shall I give you something in exchange? Claire, this is my mother, and yours." As Lady Wharton took the now sobbing girl in her arms, Gerald turned aside, tore the will in two, and dropped it on the fire which the servants had lighted. But Mr. Harling sprung forward and snatched the half-burned document from the grate. "Excuse me, young man," he said dryly. "You forget that I've an interest in the property." And he carefully extinguished the paper, folded it as carefully, and with a nod placed it in his pocket. The wedding was to have been a quiet one, quite quiet, but perhaps no one was very much surprised to find, when the bridal party made its way to the church, that the time-beaten little edifice was crammed, that not only the churchyard but a large space in front of it was filled with an eager, excited, and delighted crowd. Carriages lined the roads, gay with bunting and laurel for some distance, for though the invitations had been few, the guests were many. The county simply declined to be left out of an affair which so intimately concerned it, and everybody who could be present came to look on at the most romantic wedding which had ever taken place in Regna, or in fact in the county itself. Claire had always been popular, and Gerald had won a place for himself in the hearts of the poor, and the fact that the sweet face of Sister Agnes was Lady Wharton and his mother added a zest to the situation which heightened the interest and excitement. As the bride appeared, a murmur of admiration and affection, which soon grew into a loud cheer, greeted her and sent the blood to her face. Mr. Harling, who gave her away, was perhaps the proudest man in what was afterward described as a popular demonstration, and he shook hands with Lord Chester 3 separate times, as the two men, warm friends already, made their way with difficulty through the crowd. But indeed his pride seemed to be shared by the whole throng, who felt as if the Mistress of Court Regna belonged to every one of them, as indeed, in the best of all senses, she did, and continued to belong. As for Gerald, his pride in the lovely creature who was that day made his own was overwhelmed by a joy so great as to fill him with a wondering amazement. It seemed to him, even as they drove back to the court side by side and hand in hand, as if even now he doubted the reality of his overwhelming happiness, and his hand closed on hers in a grip so tight that she could feel the impress of her wedding ring — her wedding ring — on the fingers next it. "Claire, Claire, is it all a dream?" he said. She was silent a moment, then she whispered, "Yes, it is all a dream, Gerald. But you and I will go on dreaming it." They were still in dreamland as they passed up the steps lined by a cheering crowd, for the court was open to all who chose to enter its grounds that day, a crowd that shouted with all the power of its lungs, "God bless you, my lord! God bless you, Mr. Gerald! God bless you, my lady! Heaven keep you and send you happiness, Miss Claire! Long life to our lord and lady!" They were still in dreamland when they stood in the hall, surrounded by their true and tried friends, and they did not wake to the full sense of the happiness God had showered upon them until Claire was lying upon Sister Agnes's tender bosom, and they heard her murmur with a little sob, "God bless you, my son and daughter." Of that wedding breakfast Downshire in general, and Regna in particular, still talks. Lord and Lady Wharton are famous for their hospitality, but none of the splendid entertainments which have since been given by them within the stately walls of Court Regna have effaced the memory of the never-to-be-forgotten marriage feast. And men still quote, with admiration and despair, the speeches made by Mr. Harling and Lord Chester, and talk of the bride and her beauty. There is always a little pause after the excitement of such a tremendous function, and perhaps few noticed that the bride and bridegroom, attired for travelling, had stolen away, or that the Dowager Lady Wharton was also missing. These three had left the crowd of rejoicing guests and had gone down, side by side, to the little cottage in the shrubbery. It was not Lady Wharton's first visit there. As they stood by the bed, the old woman who had accompanied her in her girlish flight looked up at her with dim but smiling and loving eyes. But it was to Claire she spoke. To her, Gerald and Claire were Lord Wharton and the girl with whom she had sailed in the yacht. And as Claire bent down and kissed her, she said with placid satisfaction, "You're looking as well and bonny, my lady, as ever. And my lord, too, is just as he always was. Ah, well, you deserve a good and handsome husband, my lady. And my lord is that, let people say what they will." "Say, God bless you, nurse," whispered Claire. "God bless you, my dear," said the old woman, as if she were a little surprised at the request and Claire's emotion. "And God bless my lord, too. Does the yacht sail to-day? Is the weather fine?" "Yes, nurse," said Gerald's deep voice, "and please God, we shall have a long and prosperous voyage." Just before the happy pair entered the ribbon-bedecked carriage which was to convey them to the station, Gerald handed a long-shaped parcel to Mr. Harling. It looked as if it contained an axe, and in fact it did, and a very fine and useful axe it would have been, if Terence could ever have brought himself to use it, instead of hanging it over his fireplace, and pointing it out to everyone who entered the hut, and insisting upon telling them the wonderful story of its donor. It may be mentioned that Gerald and Claire themselves found it there when they paid Terence a visit later on. With shouts of, "Come back soon! Come back soon!" ringing in their ears, they were whirled to the station, and at last, in the reserved carriage of the London express, realized that they were alone. It is a strange feeling, that isolation in the midst of a great joy and absorbing happiness. These two could only look into each other's eyes in silence for a time. Then Gerald said, as he drew the costly furs more closely round the woman whose small hands had opened the gates of the earthly paradise for him, "Claire, that cry of theirs echoes in my ear. We must go back soon. We shall be happy over there in the warmth and sunshine. But Court Regna lies very near my heart, almost as near as its queen." She nestled a little closer. "I first learned what love meant when I met its mistress there, and somehow it seems mean and cruel to rob it of her, even in this moment of our joy, and even though it be only for a time." "You have not robbed it, Gerald," she whispered, her lips close to his. Think, you have given it a master as well. You are Court Regna's lord and master, and mine. Be good to us both, dear my lord, for we love you passing well. The End of The Mistress of Court Regna by Charles Garvice. Recorded by Céline Major. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed presenting it to you.